The room was warm. The coffee was fresh. Outside, the lake was still and quiet, frozen under a pale January sun. 15 men sat around a polished table in a beautiful lakeside villa in Berlin. They laughed. They smoked. They adjusted their ties. And while doing so, they calmly discussed how to remove an entire people from the face of the earth. Not like soldiers in battle, not like mobs in rage, but with paperwork, signatures, schedules, and trains. This was not chaos. This was not madness. It was organization, coordination, planning. A genocide assembled like an office project. And the most unsettling part is not that these men believed their mission was necessary. It's how ordinary they were, how polite, how administrative, how civilized they looked while planning the most industrialized mass murder in human history. The world would later call it the Holocaust. But here, in this quiet villa, on a cold morning in January 1942, it had a beginning. The Wannsee Conference, where genocide wasn't shouted. It was agreed upon, over chairs pushed in neatly, over cigarettes flicked into crystal trays, over the sound of pens, quietly signing death. And once you see how it happened here, you can never look at history or bureaucracy the same way again. Chapter 1. Europe Before the Storm. The Roots of Nazi Antisemitism. They say the beginning of a catastrophe rarely looks like one. Often it begins quietly, with a whisper, a belief, a story told long enough that people stop questioning it. Long before the meetings, the trains, the camps, the gas chambers, before the Wannsee Conference itself, there was an idea so old that it had become invisible like the air, yet it would shape the fate of millions. It was the belief that Jews were not simply different, but dangerous, not neighbors, not citizens, but enemies. And that belief had centuries to grow. Europe had been telling this story for almost 1,000 years. In medieval markets, in church sermons, in whispered rumors passed from parent to child. Jews were blamed for plague when disease swept across cities, as if illness could be guided by religion. They were accused of poisoning wells, of spreading corruption, of being eternally foreign, no matter how many generations had lived in the same streets. They were marked, sometimes literally, forced into separate clothing, separate laws, separate quarters. And when kings needed to cancel debts, they expelled them entirely, as though an entire people could be exiled like a stain on the map. This was not yet the Holocaust, but this was the soil it needed. By the 19th century, Europe was changing. New sciences were emerging. Railways were being built. Industry rose. Empires expanded. And with this came something darker, disguised as knowledge, racial theory. People began measuring skulls, noses, heights, claiming they could determine behavior, morality, and human worth from the shape of a bone. It was not science, but it sounded like science, and that made it powerful. Suddenly, hatred could be printed in books, taught in universities, debated in salons. It became respectable to believe that humanity was divided into races, each locked forever into hierarchy. And Jews, once hated for religion, were now claimed to be biologically other, unchangeable, permanent, unassimilable. This shift was devastating, because one can leave a religion, one cannot leave blood. Across Europe, nationalist movements were forming, each declaring that a nation belonged to a single people, a single culture, a single identity. But Jews lived everywhere. Polish Jews, German Jews, Hungarian Jews, Russian Jews. They spoke the languages, held professions, paid taxes, served in armies, taught in schools. They were part of the countries around them. Yet nationalist ideologues insisted that they did not belong, that they cannot belong. And when a nation imagines itself as a family, anyone outside that imagined bloodline becomes a threat. Then came the First World War, a war that no one expected to last so long, cost so much, or destroy so many. By its end, empires collapsed like decaying pillars. Millions lay dead. Cities were in ruins. And Germany, once proud, stood defeated, humiliated, broken. Hunger stalked the streets. Soldiers returned from the front to find no jobs, no stability, no honor. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations so large they strangled the economy. Inflation devoured savings overnight. A loaf of bread could cost what a lifetime of work once earned. And in moments of chaos, people search for explanations. Simple ones. Someone to blame. Someone to point to and say, they did this. It was here that old hatred found new fire. Far-right nationalists in Germany began to push a lie. They claimed that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed from within. That the soldiers had fought bravely, but politicians, socialists, and especially Jews had stabbed the nation in the back. There was no evidence. None. But the lie was seductive. It allowed people to turn humiliation into anger. And anger is easier to bear than grief. Among those who heard and embraced this lie was a failed artist and former corporal named Adolf Hitler. He had returned from the war furious, disillusioned, hungry for something to believe in. And when he heard the story that the war had been lost because of internal traitors, something in him ignited. He found purpose in hatred, direction in resentment, identity in fanaticism. He began attending nationalist meetings, then giving speeches. His voice was raw, emotional, hypnotic. He understood something crucial. If you could make people afraid, you could make them obedient. Hitler did not invent antisemitism. He refined it, weaponized it, industrialized it. He claimed that Jews were not simply outsiders but parasites, not merely different but destructive. He described Germany as a living body and Jews as a disease, corrupting it from within. And just as a doctor must remove disease, German society, he argued, must remove Jews. Where others had whispered these beliefs, Hitler shouted them. And the louder he shouted, the more people listened. Because he promised something seductive: restoration, pride, order, purpose, a return to greatness. But to return to greatness, there needed to be an enemy. The Nazi worldview reframed history itself as a biological war. Nations became organisms. Races became armies. Peace was impossible. Survival required dominance. And in this worldview, Jews were the ultimate enemy, not because of what they did, but because of what the Nazis claimed they were. Eternal, hidden, infecting the body of Europe. It was the perfect conspiracy, invisible yet everywhere. Germany was desperate for answers, for direction, for identity. And Hitler provided one. He promised revival. He promised unity. He promised to make Germany proud again. And he promised that to achieve this, the Jewish presence must be ended, not relocated, not diminished, ended. As Hitler's National Socialist movement grew, the symbols and rituals of the party became more than politics. They became religion. Torches, flags, marches, songs sung in unison by thousands. A sea of raised arms in perfect rhythm. It gave men who felt powerless a sense of belonging. It turned isolation into community. It turned fear into fury. And the more the nation listened, the more dangerous the message became. By the time Hitler rose to chancellor in the early 1930s, the foundation had already been laid. The laws restricting Jewish participation in society did not shock the public. They felt familiar, expected, almost natural. The discrimination did not begin with barbed wire. It began with schoolbooks, with posters, with newspaper cartoons, with professors teaching that Jews were biologically inferior, with the slow normalization of contempt. The world did not wake up one morning and watch the Holocaust begin. It drifted there, piece by piece, law by law, speech by speech. 1,000 small steps made by ordinary people who believe themselves to be good citizens following a shared vision. In Berlin, in Munich, in Hamburg, the streets filled not with chaos, but with spectacle. Parades, speeches, festivals. The promise of unity was intoxicating. The promise of a purified nation felt righteous. And slowly, gradually, hatred became patriotic. Exclusion became moral. The idea that Jews should be removed became something spoken openly, proudly. By then, the story was almost complete. The villain had been named. The disease had been identified. The cure was being prepared. All that remained was a question. How? How do you remove millions of people who have lived among you for centuries? How do you convince a nation to erase neighbors, friends, colleagues, teachers, children? How do you turn ordinary citizens into instruments of annihilation? The answer would not come in the streets. It would not come in the rallies. It would come in quiet rooms, in government offices, in letters stamped and filed, in trains scheduled with precision, in meetings like the one at Wannsee, where genocide would be spoken of not as horror, but as logistics. The world was not ready for what was coming. And most terrifying of all, the men who would carry it out did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as administrators. The next chapter begins where the laws turn into action, and the first sparks of industrial murder ignite. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Nazi Regime, from Discrimination to Isolation. The first time a neighbor's door was closed to a family because of a piece of paper, no one called it the beginning of a crime. It was a polite refusal, a landlord's note. A teacher told a parent that their child would no longer be allowed to join the class picnic. That is how ordinary oppression begins, small, plausible, almost bureaucratic in its cruelty. Imagine standing at a doorway as a hand slides a typed notice across the threshold. Imagine the paper's edge catching the light like a small, final verdict. That sound, soft, thin, final, was the sound of Germany changing. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they did not invent hatred overnight. They fed it. They organized it. They systematized contempt into law and custom. In the dim corridors of ministries and in bright town halls, a new grammar of exclusion was written. Who could vote? Who could teach? Who could practice law? Who could own a business? The rules arrived like weather, gradual at first, then a storm. For Jews in Germany, life shifted from being a matter of daily negotiation to becoming a constant accounting of what was permitted and what was not. At first it was visible in the marketplace. Shop fronts that had once welcomed customers now hung signs, subtle or blatant, that marked them as Jewish, for Aryans only, or simply an absence. No name on the door, no family photograph in the window. Imagine the smell of polish and bread in a bakery where the owner no longer served certain regulars. That silence at the counter was a social shudder, closing slowly over entire communities. Business accounts were frozen. Contracts were canceled. Licenses were revoked. The law, which should protect, began to pick and choose whose rights it would honor. The Nuremberg Laws, announced in 1935, were a turning point. They were framed as technical, legal, even clinical. They spoke of citizens and subjects, of bloodlines and racial descent. But underneath the terminology lay a moral verdict. Some people, because of their ancestry, would no longer be full members of the nation. The laws forbade marriage between Jews and non-Jews. They stripped many of German citizenship, and they introduced a legal apparatus to categorize human beings by degrees of Jewishness, as if one could measure belonging with a ruler. The act of drafting such laws was itself a form of violence. To put prejudice into a statute is to make it harder to oppose. Once the state began to define identity, daily life became a field of identifiers. Certificates, passports, registration cards, all of them demanded answers about ancestry. Jewish citizens were required to declare their backgrounds, to produce papers that proved who they were. These documents traveled. They were copied. They were shared between offices. They became the raw material for decisions about employment, education, housing, and mobility. Paperwork, which should have been mundane, became the scaffolding of exclusion. Propaganda filled the silence left where human warmth should have been. Through film reels, posters, radio broadcasts, and newspapers, the Nazi machine worked steadily to reforge how Germans saw each other. The streets overflowed with images that simplified and dehumanized, turning complex lives into caricatures. Cartoons showed Jews as greedy, scheming, animalistic. Radio commentators spoke of foreign elements in the body of the nation. In cinemas and classrooms, narratives were repeated until they felt like common sense. It is one thing to hear a lie. It is another to hear it every day in the background of life until it becomes the soundtrack of truth. Propaganda was not simply about insults. It was about reshaping memory. Photographs from earlier eras of Jewish soldiers fighting in the Great War, of Jewish families celebrating in German towns, were edited out of public albums or left unprinted. Veterans who had worn the same uniforms as their neighbors were erased from postcards. Children learned a version of history where Jews were absent or villainous. When a people's shared past is rewritten, their present becomes easier to deny. Education, a primary vessel for civic values, was turned into a production line for conformity. Textbooks were rewritten. Biology lessons hinted that difference equaled danger. History classes retold events through the lens of racial struggle. Teachers who resisted were punished or dismissed. Schools filled with songs and marches that taught children to chant unity and to scorn the outsider. Imagine a classroom in which the taste of chalk and the scrape of a slate are accompanied by a new lesson: that some classmates were less worthy. Small children learned to point without understanding why it hurt. The transformation infiltrated intimate spaces. Neighborhoods shifted as social clubs closed their doors. Clubs that had once hosted mixed concerts and charity events went Aryan only. Synagogues and community centers saw fewer faces, not because people wished to stay away, but because they were denied attendance. Weddings became quieter. Birthdays were celebrated in secret. Social gestures, invites to tea, to take a stroll, were withheld. The tactile norms of neighborliness frayed. Hands that once reached to shake were no longer extended. At the same time, the economy began to be weaponized. The state encouraged Aryanization, the process by which Jewish-owned businesses were transferred, often forcibly and always unfairly, to non-Jewish ownership. Imagine a man watching his life's work: rows of ledgers, dusty shelves, the smell of leather of receipts, being assessed by strangers, then handed over under duress for a pittance. Shops changed names overnight. Signs were painted over. The transfer of property was stylized as a patriotic act, a cleansing of the national economy. Official ceremonies sometimes accompanied these transfers, as if theft needed the ritual of legitimacy. The legal machinery often had a theatrical quality. Public humiliations were staged to demonstrate power. Jewish professionals lost licenses to practice medicine, law, and teaching. A doctor who had saved lives before the regime found himself stripped of the right to treat non-Jewish patients. An engineer could no longer sign building plans. A teacher's voice was silenced. The sensory world shifted. Clinics where the antiseptic smell mixed with authority were suddenly marked by closed doors. Laboratories became empty, echoing rooms. Those who had once held community roles became ghostly presences in the places where they had mattered most. But it was not only state policy that isolated. Ordinary citizens were pressured to conform through social incentives and penalties. Neighbors were encouraged by slogans, by surveillance, by the chilling knowledge that denunciation often came with rewards to watch and to report. This created an atmosphere of mistrust. People learned to speak in coded ways, to count their words. The sound of footsteps at night could mean a friend calling, or a Gestapo officer looking for the wrong signature. Kitchens, once places of gossip and comforting smells, turned into spaces where such conversation could be dangerous. One of the cruelest features of this phase was how the regime exploited legalism to mask illegality. By drafting laws, by instituting regulations, the Nazis wrapped cruelty in the language of the law. It looked orderly. It sounded reasonable when read aloud in courtrooms or announced in official bulletins. Yet the law became a weapon, wielded not to ensure justice, but to legitimize exclusion. This perversion of legality made resistance seem irrational. Who could argue against the law? Who could refuse a notice signed by a minister? At the same time that Jews in Germany found doors closing, the state also created categories of exception, small windows that offered a terrible calculus. Some professions were initially exempt from certain restrictions, often because the state needed specific skills. These exceptions made the policy look less monstrous to outsiders. It softened the edges. But it also sowed confusion and false hope among those targeted, as families clung to temporary exemptions that could be, and would be, rescinded. The illusion of protection was itself a form of cruelty, an intermittent mercy that lured people into compliance and delay. Violence, when it came, was both spontaneous and organized. Pogroms, mass attacks on Jewish property and persons, could erupt with public frenzy, but they were often permitted, even encouraged, by officials who turned a blind eye. The most infamous of these early state-enabled outbreaks of violence was Kristallnacht in 1938. In that night of broken glass, synagogues burned while crowds watched, shop windows were smashed, Jewish homes were ransacked. The sound of shattering glass is a sound that lingers in memory, the brittle rain of civilization cracking in the dark. Kristallnacht was a public spectacle, part mob, part government-orchestrated purge. For some citizens, it was the first moment the persecution became unmistakable. For many Jews, it was the moment the last illusions of safety were shattered. After such nights, the regime tightened the screws. Laws became harsher. Fines were levied against Jewish communities for the damage inflicted upon them. An absurd and vicious accounting that demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of the system. Arrests increased. Men were rounded up and sent to early concentration facilities. The state tested its reach, and the reach proved long. Yet even as repression deepened, many in Germany, inside and outside the regime, accepted or even embraced these changes because of fear, opportunism, or belief. Some citizens prospered from confiscations. Some believed the nationalist rhetoric wholeheartedly. Others remained silent because speaking up felt like a dangerous, futile act. Courage was fragmented, courageous acts were piecemeal, and the institutional mechanisms for justice were eroded. Internationally, reactions were mixed. Some foreign governments issued protests. Some private citizens raised money. Some newspapers condemned the measures. But there was no unified or forceful intervention. Economic interests, isolationist politics, the shadow of the Great Depression, and the complexity of refugee policy all dampened effective response. For the victims, this lack of decisive international sanctuary intensified their isolation. Borders that might have been open were bureaucratically narrowed. Timetables for visas were tightened. Imagine standing at a foreign embassy, feeling the heavy paper of passport forms and being told, in a flat voice, that today is not the day to leave. The sound of a clerk's stamp hitting a page could feel like a jailer's knock. Through all of this, daily life for Jewish families became a series of negotiations. Over schools, over markets, over whether a letter would be delivered. Parents tried to shield children from taunts, from the tightness of doors, from the knowledge that their neighbors might not come to a funeral. They haggled for whatever scraps of normalcy persisted. A recipe, a family photograph brought out and placed in a safer drawer, a clandestine dinner with trusted friends. The smell of stew might remain a comfort, but even that could acquire the taste of fear. Conversation over a meal often ended abruptly at the sound of a car on the street. And yet, within Jewish communities, new forms of courage emerged. Organizations that try to support, to provide legal assistance, to find safe passage abroad. Rabbis, social workers, teachers, and ordinary neighbors mobilized networks to help those at greatest risk. They organized fundraising, found false papers, arranged for children to be sent away where possible. These acts did not end the tide, but they were lifelines. They were, in their small way, a refusal to let the story end with paperwork. By the time the curtain fell on this chapter of history, discrimination had become institutionalized. What began as exclusion was now a machinery, part legal code, part social practice, part violence. The nation had been reimagined, not as a pluralistic community, but as a purified collective, an organism that required removal of what it considered foreign. The moral landscape had shifted. Neighbors had been turned into strangers by decree. And yet, for all its apparent finality, this transformation carried a terrible, practical question that even the architects of exclusion could not avoid. Once someone is stripped of rights and dignity, what do you do next? Where do the marginalized go when they are denied the right to live, work, and move? The answer, horrifyingly, will be found not only in marching crowds or in law books, but in rooms of men and women who would treat the fate of human beings as an administrative problem. The small acts of closure, doors shut softly over notices, signs painted over, papers stamped Jewish, would soon be supplemented by plans to move entire populations. The machinery assembled in these early years of discrimination would become the blueprints for far more terrible actions. The next chapter will follow the radicalization from exclusion to mass murder, and the terrible experiments in killing that would convince planners that industrial methods were necessary. Chapter 3: Kristallnacht, the night the world looked away. The first sound was glass, a brittle rain that began at twilight and did not stop until the city itself seemed to be crying shards. Windows, once the mundane frames of everyday life, exploded into the night with a noise like brittle applause. In courtyards and main streets, shopkeepers stepped onto stoops, blinking at the sudden darkness where a light had been. Faces caught the flicker of flames licking at wooden rafters. The smell of smoke threaded through coats and hair like an accusation. This was not a spontaneous riot. It was a performance. It was choreography disguised as fury. And the choreography had been approved. In the weeks before that night, in November of 1938, the mood had been a slow burn. Rumors, insults turned louder, threats that began as shoves and ended as orders. The regime had not simply given permission for violence. It had rehearsed it with signals and silence. Local officials, police commanders, party leaders, they did not always shout the plans into the streets. More often, they shared them in curt memos, in offhand remarks at meetings, in the removal of patrols from certain neighborhoods where mobs would be directed. Imagine the quiet before a storm, not just in the sky, but in the offices and cafes of the city. The clink of teaspoons on saucers as men discussed logistics. The gentle rustle of paper as telegrams were drafted and then quietly redirected. The machinery moved before the mob did. The immediate pretext was the assassination in Paris of a German diplomat, a young official shot by a Polish-Jewish teenager who was responding, in his despair and fury, to reports of persecution back home. The murder was used like oil on a match. Propaganda organs poured forth outrage, inflaming the public by painting the act as proof of a Jewish conspiracy against Germany. Newspapers that week displayed fierce headlines. Radio broadcasts fanned the flames with rhetoric about betrayal and threat. But causation and condemnation are not the same. Millions of grievances do not justify mass punishment. Yet the narrative was simple and seductive. One outrage met with a reprisal against a whole people. When the evening came, mobs moved with an efficiency that betrayed planning. In many places, they were not ragged crowds but organized groups. Stormtroopers, members of party militias, ordinary citizens coaxed into action, and in some cases, people coerced by fear into joining the spectacle. They wore coats and hats like anyone else. They brought hammers, stones, clubs. Some carried banners. Others had lists. They entered Jewish shops and apartments not as thieves seeking profit, but as agents enacting a social purge. Windows were smashed not merely to destroy property, but to send a message that the private world could be violated at will. In synagogues, places of prayer, of Torah and song, the violence was uniquely harrowing. These spaces, which had for centuries held the sound of prayer and the scent of incense and baked challah, were torched or desecrated. Flames licked at hymnals. Pews blackened and crumbled. Torah scrolls, rolled with care and reverence, were burned or torn. The sound of a burning synagogue is a sound that seems to turn a people's memory into smoke. For those who witnessed it, the sensation was physical. The heat against the face, the acrid sting of smoke in the eyes, the muffled crack of timber giving way. And in those moments, Ordinary worship spaces were transformed into stages of humiliation. Jewish homes were invaded. Imagine standing in a parlor that had known laughter and birthday candles, a place where the texture of upholstery and the framed photograph on the mantel carried decades of domestic life, and then hearing the door crash, men flooding in, objects smashed, family Bibles and portraits hurled to the floor. People were beaten in their own kitchens. Children clung to the skirts of mothers, while strangers demanded papers and valuables. The sensory world of home, the rustle of linens, the smell of stew, was replaced by the metallic tang of fear, by the hard slap of a hand, by the muffled sobs that sound like small broken instruments. The destruction was not limited to property. Humiliation was part of the tactic. Jewish men were dragged from their homes, arrested on fabricated charges, or simply rounded up as a show of power. Many were taken to makeshift detention centers and later to early concentration camps, places of overcrowding, of cold cement and thin blankets. Imagining a first night in such a place, the hard scrape of thin mattress covers, the clack of boots on concrete, the damp chill that finds the bone. These detentions were not merely punitive. They were a trial run, a method to see how far the apparatus could push before society pushed back. The cost was immediate and lasting. Hundreds of synagogues were damaged or destroyed. Thousands of businesses were looted and closed. Homes were vandalized. One could count the shattered windows, the burned interiors, the lost livelihoods, but those numbers do not capture what was ripped from the heart of communities. A sense of belonging, the ordinary trust that neighbors share, the belief that private life is worth protecting. People stood in the gray light after the mobs dispersed, holding what remained: a singed book, a charred photograph, a rag of cloth that had been a curtain. The tactile residue of that night was the proof that terror leaves in its wake. What made Kristallnacht different from earlier acts of discrimination was its scale and its publicness. Where previously many hateful acts were cloaked in bureaucracy, permits denied, licenses revoked, here violence was performed openly. It was visible in the streets in a way that was intended to instruct. The point was not only to punish, but to broadcast the regime's authority. You could not imagine yourself safe. Your place in society was precarious and contingent. The spectacle was a lesson delivered in glass and flame. Internationally, reactions were a mixture of shock, outrage, and, often, impotence. Newspapers in other countries blasted the events with moral fury. Diplomats lodged protests. Yet the world's outrage did not translate into immediate, sweeping action to protect the vulnerable. Visa policies remained strict. Quotas for refugees were narrow. Financial and political considerations, economic strain, isolationist sentiment, the complexity of migration, curbed bold interventions. In consular offices, hopeful families filled out forms and awaited answers that rarely arrived in time. The bureaucratic language of diplomacy, polite, legal, endless, did not match the urgency of lives at risk. The sound of an embassy stamp, the quiet slap of ink, could not, in that crisis, stop the burning of synagogues. Within Germany, many ordinary citizens watched and fell silent. Some cheered. Some joined in looting, seeking profit in the chaos. A few tried to intervene, but intervention was rare and dangerous. The moral courage required to stand in the street and block an assailant's swing was too costly for many. This silence was not merely passive. It was a form of participation. The state had turned on the theater lights and waited to see who would step forward to applaud. The night's choreography also revealed how thoroughly the state had penetrated social life. Police often stood aside or even assisted in rounding up victims. Fire brigades, charged with saving property, sometimes arrived late or were instructed to let certain buildings burn. Local officials who might have been expected to protect citizens instead enforced humiliation by recording damage and, perversely, locking the survivors out of insurance claims. The mechanisms of civic duty, those routines that managed emergencies, were repurposed to make suffering efficient. The aftermath was both legal and symbolic. Jewish communities were fined for the very damage inflicted upon them, an absurd accounting of cruelty that forced victims to pay for their own pillage. Banks froze accounts. Businesses bearing Jewish ownership were forced to sell, often at a fraction of their worth, in waves of coerced transfer. The legal language of restitution was inverted into a ledger of punishment. Pay for the broken glass. Compensate the state for the costs of police action. This bureaucratic twist revealed the regime's bureaucratic genius. Evil wrapped itself in administrative form, and thus gained a perverse legitimacy. For the victims, the night was also an inflection point in decision-making. Families who had been managing the narrowing margins of life now faced raw possibility: flee, hide, resist, or wait. For some, the options were simple because escape routes were closed. For others, the night made flight urgent. But leaving required paperwork, permits, money, and, crucially, a destination willing to accept refugees. The infrastructure of escape, networks of aid societies, visas, foreign sponsors, strained under the sudden demand. Imagine packing in the hours after dawn, folding a child's sweater into a suitcase that might never be claimed, tucking away a family photo, and wondering whether holding it would be a comfort or a curse. The tactile act of packing became a ritual of farewell and of uncertain hope. Kristallnacht also accelerated legal exclusion. In the mornings after the violence, decrees multiplied. Jewish businesses were proscribed from certain sectors. Cultural associations were dissolved. Children were barred from some schools. Passports were confiscated. The state converted spontaneous terror into codified policy. The law caught up with the mob and then pushed further. This move from lawless violence to structured oppression made persecution more efficient and, chillingly, more predictable. Yet even in such darkness, people resisted in small ways. Some neighbors, appalled by what they saw, sheltered a family for a night. Rabbis and community leaders scrambled to secure funds and contacts. Youth groups organized letter-writing campaigns to foreign officials. Underground networks began to form instructions for escape. These acts of solidarity were often clandestine, fragile, and dangerous, but they were also proof that the moral fabric had not been entirely unraveled. Historians later pinpoint Kristallnacht as a pivotal moment, the night when state-sanctioned hatred shed further pretense and revealed its capacity for open brutality. But the transformation had been incremental. Laws, propaganda, social ostracism, and economic pressure had already prepared the ground. Kristallnacht merely detonated that pressure in a way both dramatic and deliberate. It was not a spontaneous eruption of popular fury. It was a planned escalation, a rehearsal in cruelty with a public audience. And still, a question lingered in the smoke-filled dawn. If a state could orchestrate such a night, and if the international community would look on with protests but little else, then what came next? If synagogue fires could be set with little consequence, if businesses could be looted under the banner of national cleansing, what limits remained? How far could the machinery of exclusion be pushed when it had proven able to mobilize both the street and the registry office? The answer would not be found in this night alone. Kristallnacht exposed a direction, a radicalization, but it did not, by itself, invent the full-scale machinery of genocide that would follow. What it did, however, was clear. The veneer of civilization could be stripped away with frightening ease. A nation could normalize spectacle as policy. And in the emptiness left by burnt prayer books and shattered glass, policymakers and perpetrators would find both permission and precedence to plan the next, more efficient stages of persecution. The scene was set. The audience had watched. The question now was whether the world would continue merely to watch. Chapter 4. War in the East. The crucible of radicalization. The first sound you notice is not guns, but the distant scrape of wheels over gravel, the low and endless rumble of columns moving east. Imagine standing on a frozen road in late autumn, the air so sharp it stings the lungs. Coal smoke tangs at the back of your throat. The gray sky seems to press down like a hand. Men in uniforms pass in a steady stream, faces set under caps, breath fogging in the cold. They are not yet hardened killers, at least not all of them. They are soldiers, bureaucrats, policemen, technicians, people organized for an invasion. But as the war pushes into vast territories of the Soviet Union, those columns will pass through towns where the ground is wet with earlier blood. The invasion of the East would do more than redraw borders. It would become an open laboratory for radical ideas about race, about enemies, and about how to make killing efficient. When the German army crossed the border in June of 1941, it carried the language of blitzkrieg, lightning war, promising speed and decisive victory, like a blade meant to cut through defensive lines before slow attrition could grind men down. Tanks thundered, aircraft screamed overhead, infantry marched. In the early days, it felt to many like a juggernaut of modern warfare, precise, fast, unstoppable. But the war in the East was not merely a contest of battalions. It was also an ideological crusade for those who believed that the front was not just territory, but a theater for racial cleansing. The Eastern Campaign would provide a landscape where theory could be tested in practice, and practice would grow crueler with each adaptation. The first weeks brought military success, but the successes came with a cost. In towns across Poland and the Soviet borderlands, Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the army. They were not part of the regular army in the sense of traditional battlefield engagements. They were special detachments of security police, SS men, and collaborators assembled to secure rear areas. On paper, their job was simple: remove partisans, suppress resistance, and eliminate what the regime called undesirables. In practice, this often meant rounding up Jewish men, sometimes entire families, and shooting them in ditches, ravines, and forests. The methods were brutal and intimate. Victims were ordered to strip. Blankets smelled of damp earth. The metallic tang of fear was everywhere. The sound of rifles, the slap of bodies hitting ground, the quiet sobs. These are the raw, human noises that puncture doctrine. What makes these early massacres crucial to understanding the Holocaust is their intimacy. Killing by bullets is close. It forces a human face on both victim and perpetrator. Many of the men who pulled triggers were not monsters by common reckoning. Some were clerks, former school teachers, policemen, people who had chosen normal lives before the war. But proximity changes people. To stand over another human and press a rifle to the neck creates a psychological strain. Commanders noted it. There were complaints about the strain on shooters. Reports spoke of trembling, of fits, of psychological breakdowns. The killings were effective, but they were perceived as messy. Bodies needed burial. Mass graves were visible. The tasks left a residue of trauma among the killers themselves. For those committed to a systemic solution, this was a practical problem. How to remove entire populations without exacting unbearable costs on those who carried out the murders. Out of that practical problem came experimentation. The idea of speeding up death, of removing the intimate act of shooting, began to circulate in bureaucratic memoranda and whispered conversations. Gas vans, sealed trucks into which engine exhaust was piped, appeared as an early technological answer. Victims were led into a compartment, doors closed. The roar of a motor filled the space. A man clutched at the air as it thickened with fumes. The smell inside was a choking, oily scent that mixed with fear, windows fogged with breath and the heat of panic. While the method distanced the direct shooter from the act, it created other horrors. Death by suffocation is a prolonged, agonizing process, and those who witnessed it sometimes found the moral cost as great as that of the rifle. Yet to planners, it was an improvement in the calculus of logistics. The war in the East also revealed the depth of local complicity and the complexity of occupation. In many towns, long-standing anti-Semitic tensions were exploited or reawakened. Neighbors who had previously shared markets and festivals turned suspicious. Some collaborated eagerly, motivated by greed, revenge, or opportunism. Others resisted quietly, risking everything to hide a child or a neighbor. The soundscape of these towns was strange. Daily commerce ticking on, carts creaking, church bells ringing, even as clandestine lists of names were compiled in municipal offices. Collaboration often stemmed from ordinary motives. Someone wanted a shop, a house, a field. In other cases, the occupiers recruited locals into auxiliary police forces, turning neighbors into instruments of persecution. The moral geography of the occupied territories changed overnight. As mass shootings continued, bureaucrats in Berlin took notice. Reports returned describing thousands murdered in single operations, the logistics of transporting victims, the difficulties of burying bodies, the risks of disease and discovery. The language of reports was clinical: numbers, locations, timetables. Yet beneath the statistics lay staggering human loss. Command papers discussed efficiency. How many can be shot in a day? How can graves be concealed? How can local services be avoided? Those questions are small, technical, and grotesquely administrative. Yet they reveal the crucial shift. Genocide was becoming a problem to be solved, not merely an outbreak of violence. This administrative attitude gave rise to conferences and directives. Men who had previously written memos about trade or police procedures began to craft policies about life and death. They discussed schedules, transportation, and manpower. The bureaucratic mindset sought predictability. It sought to convert acts of violence into repeatable, scalable processes. In time, this logic would move the perpetrators to imagine killing as an industrial enterprise: machines, assembly lines, standard operating procedures, rather than as sporadic acts of brutality. The Eastern Campaign also made painfully clear the centrality of railways and transportation in any large-scale plan. Trains had always been arteries of modern society, moving food, coal, troops. Under occupation, they became instruments of displacement and death. Deportations were organized to move populations from villages to killing sites or to concentration points. The sound of trains, wheels screeching on rails, the hiss of steam, the clatter of carriage doors, came to signal terror. People learned to dread the whistle. In many ways, the rail system was the skeleton upon which later mass deportations would be hung. Without timetables and wagons, planners had no practical way to move millions. The experience in the East taught them that logistics were the key to scaling cruelty. Another dimension of radicalization was medical and pseudoscientific rationalization. In the occupied territories, the Nazi regime intensified its attempts to classify, measure, and categorize people according to racial theories. Field doctors and scientists set up tests, conducted surveys, and argued that certain groups were biologically inferior. These pseudoscientific practices were used not merely to justify violence, but to create a vocabulary of exclusion. Measurements, charts, and graphs became tools of policy. The tactile reality, rulers against skulls, pins marking boxes on forms, was part of the transformation of human beings into datasets. This dehumanization mattered. Once a person is a line on a ledger, it becomes easier to imagine them as expendable. Religious and cultural destruction followed military occupation. Synagogues were stripped or turned into stables in some towns. Communal libraries were looted. Cemeteries were desecrated. The sensory world of a community, its music, its rituals, the smell of candles, was ripped away or profaned. These actions were not merely collateral damage. They were intentional, meant to erase the presence of a people from the landscape. The result was a chilling silence where song once was. That silence had a sound: the creak of shuttered windows, the flap of torn prayer books, the rustle of papers taken as trophies. Resistance took many forms, though it was rarely frontal and seldom victorious at the time. Partisans in forests launched attacks, guerrilla bands sabotaged supply lines, and Jewish councils tried to organize relief and escape where possible. In cities, clandestine networks smuggled people across borders. False papers were forged. Children were hidden in attics, convents, and with sympathetic neighbors. These acts of defiance created ephemeral islands of humanity in an environment designed to crush them. The taste of that defiance was bitter and often brief, but it was also a testament to human stubbornness. The sound of whispered plans, the feel of a hidden pocket containing forged identity papers, the warmth of a stranger's hand passing a loaf of bread in the dark. By late 1941 and into 1942, the pattern of killing and deportation in the East hardened. The commanders who once improvised began to demand more systematic methods. For the Nazi leadership, the scale of killing required scale solutions. The mobile massacres had been effective in horrific ways, but they lacked the efficiency and secrecy the regime desired for a broader, pan-European solution. Too visible, too proximal, too psychologically costly for the perpetrators. That calculus pushed planners toward a new model. Concentrated sites where killing could be standardized, where death could be administered in groups rather than atomized in ditches. Within this crucible of war, ideological zeal and practical administration fused. Men in gray offices, poring over spreadsheets and transport schedules, were not removed from the killing fields. They were part of the same continuum. The East had become an apiary of experimentation, testing methods, timelines, and tactics. Lessons learned that would be transferred, systematized, and enlarged. The brutality of the front lines and the bureaucracy of the center began to mirror one another in terrifying symmetry. And yet, even as methods hardened, the moral fog thickened. Soldiers who saw civilian massacres sometimes protested. Bureaucrats worried about international reaction. Local commanders fretted about reprisals and partisans. The calculus of atrocity was not uncontested. But each hesitation was often outweighed by the momentum of war and ideology. The sense that extraordinary measures were justified by existential claims about race and destiny. This sense provided cover for the most monstrous decisions, because when an ideology convinces itself that survival is at stake, cruelty can appear as a grim necessity. The story of the East is not detachable from the story of Wannsee, because the Eastern campaigns taught the regime two crucial things: that genocide could be organized, and that modern systems of transport and administration could be bent toward destruction. The experience of mass shootings, the experiments with gas vans, the exploitation of local collaborators, the centrality of rail logistics, and the pseudo-scientific classification of populations, all these would feed into the later decisions made in quiet rooms. The front line and the office were different faces of the same enterprise. As winter tightened its grip and the first snows fell over fields where trees hid shallow graves, planners in Berlin were no longer content with improvisation. The question mutated from, can we kill, to, how do we kill millions with the least friction and the greatest secrecy? That pragmatic, bureaucratic query would bring men together in rooms with maps and coffee, in villas by lakes where the conversation would be calm, precise, administrative. The crucible had done its work. The radicalization born of war had produced methods, and methods begot plans. Somewhere beyond the front lines, in offices smelling of piped tobacco and cold paper, the search for answers continued. The next stage would not be decided in fields or forests, but in statutes, in meetings, and in memos that turned human lives into items to schedule. The war in the East had shown the way. The question now was who would take it the furthest, and by what means. Chapter 5. The Einsatzgruppen, Killing by Bullets. They arrived like an extra unit of the occupying force, not announced with fanfare, not heralded by marching bands, but slipping into towns with the quiet confidence of men who belonged to a system. At first they were called security detachments, units tasked with mopping up, behind the front lines, with finding partisans, with restoring order. The name was clinical. The work was not. What these groups brought to towns and villages across Eastern Europe was something closer to a funeral procession for entire communities. They did not come with siege engines. They brought lists, clipboards, and rifles. They came to enact a policy that was both primitive in its violence and terrifyingly modern in its bureaucracy. Imagine a market square at dawn. The The morning light glitters off fruit crates and puddles. The air smells of damp earth and fry bread. People move among stalls. Children chase a dog. An old woman irons a ragged scarf on a wooden board. Then the sound changes. Boots on cobbles, the snap of a salute. Whispered orders pass from mouth to ear. Men with official papers approach houses. They demand names. They read lists. They separate families. There is no drama in the separation at first. Only paper and voice and the rustle of coats. But in the spaces between those small acts, decisions are being made that will turn private lives into numbers, into dates carved into memory. The Einsatzgruppen were composed of SS officers, state police, and auxiliary forces drawn from occupied populations. Their recruitment was varied. Some volunteers, some career men, some local collaborators. The composition mattered because it shaped methods of killing and patterns of complicity. In a village where neighbors had old grudges, local auxiliaries could be eager participants. In other places, officers from the Reich took the lead. The presence of locals sometimes made the operations more efficient. Lists were fuller. Guides knew where to find hidden families. But it also stained ordinary communities with extraordinary guilt. The tactile evidence of guilt was literal. Footprints in mud leading to mass graves, the glint of a confiscated wedding band, the folded corner of a photograph taken from a shuttered home. The process was chillingly routine. Victims were ordered to assemble at a designated spot, by the synagogue, near the schoolhouse, at the edge of the village green. They were told to bring valuables, to wear their best clothes, to be prepared for a transfer. This false reassurance was a tactic. Keep people calm, so they can be moved efficiently. The sound of rustling garments, the clink of hidden jewelry being gathered, the murmur of frightened voices, these were the prelude. Men were separated, often under the pretext of interrogation. Women and children sometimes followed, sometimes left behind. The separation itself was an act of violence. It severed the immediate bonds of dependency, of protection, and left many to wait and to imagine the worst. When the executions began, they were often organized like grim military exercises. Men were ordered to lie down at the edge of a ditch. The ground was cold and unforgiving. The smell of wet soil rose in a thick, earthy breath. Shooters were arranged in ranks. Victims were sometimes forced to kneel, sometimes to strip. The rifle crack in the open air is a precise, surgical sound, short, loud, final. But it was never a single shot. It was a series, a cascade. The noise echoed off trees and old stone walls. Birds that nested nearby flew away in confusion. In the days after, the air would still carry an odd metallic tang, the scent of spent powder mixing with earth and the salt of tears. There was no glamour in these killings. They were visceral, personal, intimate. To kill by bullets is to place one human face to another, to force the killer to watch the others collapse. That intimacy left marks, psychological marks, on both sides. Perpetrators reported nightmares, trembling, unsteady hands. Commanders recorded complaints about efficiency. Shooters grew pale. Their aim faltered. Men fainted. The human body recoils when set against a fellow human to kill. The complaints were practical, not moral. They spoke of fatigue and nervous strain. This matter-of-fact wording masked the deeper rupture. People trained for routine service were being pushed into acts that smashed the normal rhythms of life. To solve this problem of proximity, new ideas were tried. The Einsatzgruppen became laboratories of atrocity, experimenting with methods to reduce psychological strain and increase throughput. The gas van was one such innovation. Victims were loaded into enclosed compartments, and the vehicle's engine exhaust was channeled inside. The method removed the immediate shooter from the act. Death came slowly, a suffocating, sickening process. The sounds inside the van, the cough, the slap of a hand against a metal wall, the final collapse, were muffled, filtered into the machine. To those organizing the killings, the mechanized solution was an improvement because it separated the administrative function from the intimate deed. It also demonstrated a terrifying truth about modernity. Technology could be used to close the gap between intention and execution. The logistics of mass shootings required paperwork as much as weapons. Before an operation, lists were compiled. Names, addresses, family members. Watchmen were informed. Liaisons with municipal offices located property records and synagogue registries. Clerks logged the numbers in ledgers. These books would later become evidence, dry and terrible, of systematic brutality. The bureaucracy around murder allowed men in distant offices to claim plausible deniability. They had signed forms, they had issued orders, they had administered justice. The chill of this administrative coldness was a hallmark of the era. Human lives reduced to entries in neat columns. Local populations watched these operations in varied, complicated ways. In some places, crowds formed to watch, to gawk, to throw insults. That spectacle had a pedagogy. It taught the onlookers the stakes of compliance. In other towns, residents closed curtains, pretended not to hear, or quietly helped hide children and neighbors in cellars and attics. The acts of courage were often private, fragile things. A peasant woman offering bread to a trembling child in a dark cupboard. A priest failing to report a family in his parish. A neighbor slipping a note that led to escape. These small acts of defiance mattered. They were human echoes against the machine of death. The Einsatzgruppen also reveal the geography of memory, how places remember violence. Forests used for mass graves still hold traces. Depressions in the soil, newer saplings where old trees were felled, stones stacked as crude markers. In towns, certain streets carry a silence, or an elder's bitter reference to the night of the carts. Memory can be tactile. The coolness of a cellar where someone hid, the roughness of a blanket used to smother a child's cry, the hollow of a bell pulled once too many times. Survivors described sensory particulars that persist, the creak of a cart bringing bodies, the smell of a field after disturbance. These details anchor history in the body, refusing to let large numbers flatten the personal. As news of the massacres filtered outward, reactions ranged from stunned disbelief to muted concern. Foreign diplomats in cities filed reports back to capitals. Some governments protested. Many did not act. The world received accounts and statistics, and often treated them as yet another wartime horror among many. Yet the scale and targeted nature of these massacres carried a distinct character. They were not the chaotic violence of battle. They were organized, targeted, and thorough. That combination made them a harbinger of something else, an indication that mass murder could be practiced, refined, and then scaled. The moral questions around the Einsatzgruppen are knotty and uncomfortable. How did ordinary men become executioners? How did seemingly rational bureaucrats arrange mass killings with such dispassionate precision? Contemporary accounts and later testimonies offer multiple explanations: ideological conviction, opportunism, fear of punishment for refusal, the lure of authority, the corrosive effect of long exposure to violent tasks. Some men volunteered eagerly. Others followed orders with varying degrees of reluctance. What ties them together is a cultural context that normalized hate and framed certain people as existential threats. Within such a frame, administrative acts gained moral cover. Another layer of complexity was the use of local collaboration. In many occupied regions, the occupiers recruited auxiliary police and local militias. For these men, motivations mixed: anti-Jewish sentiment, desire for status, protection, or spoils. The involvement of locals meant that the violence could be enacted with local knowledge, where certain families might hide, which basements were accessible, where graves could be dug with secrecy. That knowledge made killing more efficient and added a corrosive social cost. Neighbors became agents of terror. The reverberations of that betrayal last generations. They complicate post-war reconciliation and leave communities with long, painful reckonings. The practical success of the Einsatzgruppen in killing vast numbers by bullets created a perverse incentive structure. Their ability to clear large areas of Jewish presence fed demand for even greater efficiency. Reports of tens of thousands murdered in operations were counted and compared like production metrics. This bureaucratic language, numbers, rates, time measured, made it easier to think about escalation. Men in offices could contemplate larger solutions, not because they were colder, but because the apparatus now promised scale. The killings in the East, brutal and immediate as they were, taught a brutal lesson. Mass extermination could be organized, and modern instruments could facilitate it. But there were consequences. Bullets were expensive. Mass graves required labor and secrecy. The psychological toll on shooters could not be ignored. And the visibility of mass shootings posed risks of discovery and international condemnation. Those practicalities nudged planners toward other methods that could be hidden, more efficient, painful though that word sounds in this context. The search for such methods accelerated the move toward gassing, toward centralized killing sites, toward industrialized death. As the Einsatzgruppen carried out their grim responsibilities, survivors' stories accumulated, stories that no ledger could fully capture. A mother cradling a child, muffling its cries. A teacher forced to dig graves with his own hands. An old man who refused to flee and was shot where he sat at his workbench. These were not statistics. They were lives that held textures. The worn fabric of a coat, the greasy smell of a bakery counter, the small bruise on a child's wrist from a hurried embrace. Those textures make history human. They also make accountability necessary. The operations of the Einsatzgruppen also left legal traces. After the war, the records, the telegrams, the reports, the memos would be used in tribunals. Men who had listed numbers and sent dispatches would later be confronted with those very pages. The dry tone of reports, the administrative neatness, could not conceal the enormity of what they described. Justice, where it arrived, used those records to tie names to deeds, to assert that behind the euphemisms lay deliberate choice. And yet, even with the records, an uneasy silence remained. Many perpetrators never faced trial. Many communities never fully reckoned with local collaboration. The geography of guilt and memory remained uneven. Some towns erected memorials. Others lived with a quiet denial. The weight of what had occurred lingered like a persistent odor in cellars and basements, something that would not go away simply because it was ignored. By the time the Einsatzgruppen had carried out mass operations across vast swathes of Eastern Europe, the lesson was clear to those who ran the machinery. Killing could be made systematic. The next step, centralizing methods, building dedicated sites, finding ways to move people by train and to kill them more efficiently, was already being sketched in reports and whispered in conference rooms. The intimate brutality of the shooting squads had shown both the capacity and the limits of proximity. The planners who read those lessons sought ways to keep murder impersonal, hidden, and scalable. The story of the Einsatzgruppen is thus twofold. It is a record of intimate horror, of bullets and ditches and the echo of collapsing bodies. And it is a story of administrative learning, of memos that turn atrocity into policy. It is a reminder that violence can be both primitive and modern, both face-to-face and mediated by forms. And as the winter snow begins to cover the shallow graves in some fields, and as men in offices draft new proposals in heavy binders, a darker plan is beginning to take shape, one that will move killing from ditches into factories, from bullets into gas, and from improvisation into chilling, centralized design. Chapter 6. The Death Factories begin. Chelmno and the gas vans. The first machines that turned breath into death were not monstrous furnaces or cavernous rooms. They were trucks. Imagine a dull gray morning at the edge of a provincial town. Frost on the grass, the clank of harnesses, the low diesel cough of an engine. Men in uniform moved with the calm efficiency of workers loading cargo, not the theatrical fury of a mob. The victims were told they were being relocated, transported to labor, to a place where they would be resettled. They climbed into the metal belly of a van as if boarding a wagon. They closed the door on the world, listening to the echo of boots, and the last shout of a loved one fade away. Inside, the air grew thick and oily with engine fumes. The sounds were small and human. Coughs, a child's cry muffled by wood and metal, the rasping search for air. Then quiet. The van rolled on, a sealed box carrying the ordinary and the final together. In December of 1941, at a small estate near the village of Kulmhof, known in German as Chelmno, the Nazis formalized a cruel innovation. It was not glamorous. It was mechanical and hideously pragmatic. Chelmno became the site where mobile killing, refined into a grim technique, was tested and put into routine use. The idea was perversely clear. Convert vehicles into suffocating chambers, load people as if on a freight run, and let the engine do the killing. To the planners, it solved problems. It removed the need for shooters to stand face to face with victims. It reduced visible bloodshed. It masked murder in the language of transport. To those inside, it was a coffin with wheels. The vans themselves were altered for function. They were sealed, their interiors stripped and painted, exhaust systems rerouted to expel fumes into the compartment. In some accounts, the walls of the compartment would be lined to dampen sound. In others, space was tightened so that 2 dozen people could be forced to stand or lie until the air turned. Imagine the metal pressing against the skin, the smell of oil, the taste of carbon on the tongue. Human bodies produce heat and breath. Inside the van, those small signals built up, fogging any small window, pooling into a heavy, choking atmosphere. Death in these conditions was not instantaneous. It was a prolonged, anguished process, panic, clutching, the thud of bodies collapsing, filtered through metal. It is a cruelty of design, to take an everyday machine and turn it into an instrument of suffocation. The choice of Chelmno for these experiments was not random. It sat within logistical reach of large Jewish populations, notably the Lodz ghetto and other nearby communities. Trains and trucks could move people in through schedules and timetables. Ghettos supplied the human freight. In administrative offices, clerks typed lists of names. Those lists would be used to assemble transports that read, on paper, like normal transfers: times, amounts, destinations. The bureaucratic machinery hummed. Stamps, signatures, address columns. Those banal details, handwritten numbers beside family names, the neat columns of a transport schedule, became the scaffolding for mass murder. The modern state had tools that, in ordinary times, moved grain and coal. Used this way, those same tools moved death with the same efficiency. At Chelmno, the killing continued beyond the van. Bodies were removed and buried in mass graves near the estate. Later, as orders shifted and the war turned, the regime sought to erase evidence of these graves. Sonderaction 105, one of the campaigns to destroy traces, sent crews back to exhume and burn remains, to rake and scatter ash where soil once bore witness. Imagine the night work. Men leaping into pits to drag bodies, the heavy smell of burning hair and cloth, the brutal snap of bones under shovel. Those tasked with cleaning up were often coerced local labor or prisoners forced into the worst of the work. The work itself left an imprint: charred earth, hollows and fields, the metallic tang of scorched remnants that later generations would find, reluctantly, in testimony in soil. The human mechanics of Chelmno were intimate and procedural. Commandants and drivers organized schedules like foremen at a factory. There was a rhythm: lists compiled in the morning, vans loading at noon, the return to the estate by afternoon to offload the dead. Men kept records. They counted how many had been transported. Forms were filled out and sent onward. This accounting transformed atrocity into an administrative routine. Paper became both proof and shield. Signatures and stamps implied authorization. The language of logistics, containers, capacity, throughput, was applied to people as if they were goods. That linguistic shift is an essential cruelty. To use terms of commerce to describe human lives is to drain them of their dignity. Not everyone involved in the process was a fanatic. Some were functionaries caught in a system that rewarded obedience and punished refusal. Others were technicians and drivers, professionals who had known trains and trucks as neutral instruments before they were enlisted for killing. Some among them later claimed they were only following orders, only doing a job. Yet the intimacy of the work made denial difficult for many. To drive a van where people died, to pull a lever, to read a list and load a family. These are acts that leave a residue. Testimonies from after the war reveal a strange mixture of emotions: detachment, boredom, occasional revulsion, a bureaucratic focus on completion. The psychological economy of the killing process reveals how ordinary people adapt to extraordinary moral collapse when the state redefines normalcy. News of the vans and of Chelmno did not remain isolated tidings. Reports, sometimes whispered, sometimes returned in intelligence memos, meandered through administrative channels. Word of experiments traveled. The horrifying effectiveness of mobile gassing became known to other units, to planners in larger urban centers, to men who ran prisons and camps. The question then became logistical expansion. If vans could kill dozens per outing, how could the method be adapted, scaled, centralized, made less visible? The vans provided a lesson. Motorized suffocation worked, but it was costly in manpower and fuel and visibility. The logic of optimization, so familiar to engineers, began to be applied to killing. At the same time as vans served as a mobile method, other sites were being considered for more permanent solutions. Chelmno's model illustrated both advantages and limitations. Vans were mobile and flexible. They traveled directly from ghetto to death site. But the need to bury and later erase graves, the smell of burning bodies, the fuel usage, and the public knowledge of transports posed problems. The planners wanted a method that promised greater secrecy, greater capacity, and infrastructures that could be reused indefinitely. That is how the idea of stationary death factories, sites designed solely for killing, began to gather force in the minds of some architects of genocide. Those who planned such sites thought in terms familiar to any industrial designer: flow lines, separation of stages, capacity planning. People would enter through selection points, be processed, undressed, moved into chambers, killed, and then their remains would be disposed of, burned, buried, or otherwise erased. Each stage had its own staffing, its own supplies, its own list of tools. The horrifying contortion was that industrial language, assembly lines, throughput, efficiency, translated almost seamlessly to the design of death. Architects of murder borrowed from factories, from slaughterhouses, from logistics centers. The permanent camps would be built with a grim modernity: brick and concrete, rail spurs, crematoria, and administrative blocks with offices that oversaw timetables like any shipping depot. But the move from van to factory was not merely technical. It was political and moral. To establish a fixed site required coordination at higher levels. Ministries that controlled railways, departments that regulated labor, officials who could move populations across borders. It required a more comprehensive co-option of civil structures, and it meant that more parts of the German state would be implicated. The engines of modern governance, ministries, rail authorities, municipal clerks, will be asked to play explicit roles in this new system. That expansion made the plan more efficient. It also made the culpability wider. At Chelmno, the victims were often elderly, women and children, the most vulnerable from nearby ghettos. These were not men poised for battle. They were families, artisans, teachers, clerks, people whose hands had known other work: weaving, teaching, trading. To imagine their last hours is to thread together small human details: a child clutching a rag doll, the smell of a mother's scarf, the soft scrape of a leather shoe as someone steps into a van. Testimonies from survivors and bystanders, rare, fragmented, precious, record these textures. They prevent history from turning victims into numbers. They insist on the human textures: the weight of a suitcase, the murmur of whispered prayers, the taste of stale bread eaten hurriedly, because the journey pretended to be temporary. Public reaction outside occupied territories was slow and limited. Messages reached foreign diplomats, refugees, and Jewish organizations. There were calls for intervention, for pressure on governments to open borders, to react with force. But global priorities, war economies, and restrictive immigration policies choked many avenues of escape. Visa quotas and bureaucratic red tape became lethal barriers. The sound of an embassy stamp could mean the difference between life and death. Appeals for asylum died in files. Pleas for rescue were turned into requests for more paperwork. In the meantime, the machinery of death learned from each iteration, refined, and prepared to expand. One of the most startling aspects of Chelmno and the vans was how quickly an experimental method could become routine. The transition from ad hoc atrocity to scheduled murder did not require massive ideological shifts. Only administrative will, logistical solutions, and a chilling devotion to efficiency. The vans were a proof of concept. They taught planners that human beings could be transported and killed on a timetable. That lesson would be amplified, duplicated, and systematized on a scale that far exceeded the capacity of a single village or a single estate. And yet, despite the engineering logic, despite the technical calculations, the moral weight of what was happening could not be entirely erased. Survivors who escaped the vans, drivers who refused to join, locals who hid neighbors. These acts refracted the darkness. The small resistances mattered. They were proofs that not everyone assimilated to the brutal new normal. They were fissures through which some light seeped, however faint. As Chelmno's methods proved effective, and as similar approaches were discussed in corridors of power, the maps began to change. Locations farther east and west were scouted for permanent facilities. Railway lines were examined, not just for troop movement, but for human cargo potential. Specialists who had once planned logistics for railways and warehouses turned their skills toward organizing death. The problem shifted from whether to kill, to where and how many. The vans had delivered their terrible lesson. Mobility and modern machinery could be harnessed to systematic murder. The question now moved to scale. If a van could kill dozens, what could a rail spur and a concrete chamber kill in a week, a month, a year? The engineers of genocide began to answer that calculus in blueprints and memos. The Chelmno experiment had completed its grim apprenticeship. The next terrible innovation would be to build factories of death on a scale that would dwarf the running vans. The decision to centralize and industrialize killing was not yet finished. It was being sketched on desks strewn with transport lists and stamped papers. The scene was set, and the architects were drafting. Chapter 7. The Problem of Coordination. Bureaucracy meets genocide. A map spread across a table can look like a promise. Lines, stations, timetables, counties, orders waiting to be executed. But a map can also be a trap. In the months and years leading up to Wannsee, the problem confronting the regime was not merely ideological will or murderous intent. It was painfully mundane. How do you make millions move? How do you synchronize ministries, armies, police, railways, and occupied administration so that the routine cogs of modern life will carry out the most extraordinary crime? The question sounds administrative because it was administrative. It sounded like memos and interoffice memos and stamps. But under those stamps lay human destinies. Think of the modern state as a machine of many gears. Some parts are loud, soldiers, parades, declarations. Other parts grind in small offices far from the spectacle. Clerks, accountants, railway schedulers, pension administrators. For 20 years, historians have shown how the Holocaust was possible because both kinds of machinery turned in the same direction. In practice, this convergence raised practical problems that had to be solved one by one. Which office signs a deportation order? Who arranges cattle wagons at the proper time? Which minister issues exemptions? And to whom? Who pays for the fuel? How are records transferred between Berlin and a small ghetto office in Galicia? The answers were not obvious, and they required negotiation, sometimes bland, bureaucratic negotiation, that was nonetheless central to genocide. At the heart of the problem was jurisdiction. The Nazi state was not a single, unified body with one voice. It was a tangle of overlapping authorities: the Reich Chancellery, multiple ministries, the SS and police apparatus, the Wehrmacht, the Foreign Office, the Interior Ministry, regional Gauleiters and local administrators. Each had its own turf, its own petty rivalries, its own need to be recognized as indispensable. Imagine a room where men argue not about whether to act, but about who would get credit for the action, who would control the budgets, who would sign the forms, and thus own the responsibility. Those quarrels were not trivial. They shaped how quickly and how ruthlessly policy could be implemented. Railways became one of the most concrete manifestations of these jurisdictional snags. A functioning rail network is a marvel of coordination in ordinary times. Schedules, rolling stock, crew rotation, fuel, track maintenance. To use such a system for mass deportations required agreement with the Reichsbahn, Germany's state railway, and with regional rail offices across occupied territories. Time slots had to be carved out, wagons requisitioned, priority over military shipments negotiated. Picture clerks at a provincial rail depot, poring over a timetable, stamping a form that read, simply, transport, human cargo. The tactile sensation, the stamp's weight, the ink's smell, was ordinary. Yet that ordinary act became the hinge on which human lives swung. Another thread of chaos came from the competing demands of occupation. Military commanders argued the front came first. Wehrmacht officers wanted secure supply lines and unhindered troop movements. They did not always welcome trains loaded with civilians that would disrupt logistics. Local civil administrators, meanwhile, needed labor to keep industries running. Camps and deportations removed workers. Factories in the Reich sometimes pleaded for exemptions because they relied on forced labor from occupied zones. This tug-of-war required convincing and bargaining. Commissions met. Circulars circulated. A voice in Berlin might demand deportations for resettlement, while a factory director in Essen would argue those very people were essential to steel production. The smell of coal in industrial towns mingled with the rust of bureaucracy in offices where such arguments were hashed out. Legal definitions were another stumbling block. The regime's racial laws had to be operationalized. Who counted as Jewish? How were mixed marriages handled? What about those with partial descent? The question seems cold and abstract, but its implications were brutally practical. A child's classification decided whether a family would be placed on a transport list or left behind under some bureaucratic exemption. Ministries argued over definitions not as metaphysical debates, but as criteria that determined who could be removed and who would be temporarily protected. Officials drafted lists, compiled forms, demanded birth certificates, religious records, municipal registries. The tactile reality of stamps and signatures again played a lethal role. A document bearing an official seal could be the difference between life and death. Money, always the lubricant of state action, presented further complications. Who paid for the trains? How would local administrations bear the cost of deportations? Sometimes the answer was cynical. The state billed Jewish communities for their own deportations. In other instances, the Reich budget absorbed costs but used accounting tricks to mask expenditures. Financial negotiation turned moral atrocity into ledger entries. These accounting choices allowed deniability and distributed responsibility across departments that could claim they merely followed budgetary protocols. The sound of an accountant's adding machine, the little tick and clack of numbers being entered, could be heard in the background of genocide. It is a small, awful detail, the bureaucrat's calculator as an accomplice. Communication lag mattered. The front moved, orders changed, and local officials in a small town could wait days for guidance from Berlin. Those delays were dangerous. A train that left a day late could mean a hidden window of escape for a family. A telegram that arrived with incomplete instructions could lead to confusion at a railway siding, to chaos at a platform. For the planners in Berlin, the solution was to build redundant channels, cables, couriers, local powers granted temporary authority to ensure that directives would be implemented swiftly. That redundancy itself required structure. Who had the authority to release a wagon slot at short notice? Who could requisition local police to assist? Each yes or no was a lever that could speed up or slow down atrocity. The role of local administrators, and their varying degrees of willingness, cannot be overstated. Some were zealots, eager to comply. Some were careerists who saw compliance as a way to advance. Some were petty men who used the chaos to settle old scores. And some resisted, quietly, with small acts that mattered, delaying a list, misfiling a name, keeping a form unsigned. These acts of obstruction could save lives. Think of a municipal clerk idly choosing to take his lunch break and thus miss a midday roundup. Think of a train conductor who, through a small act of delay, allows a family to slip away. The human textures, sweat on a brow, the creak of a municipal chair, the smell of a baker's shop nearby, are the settings in which such choices unfolded. It was in such context that the SS and the Reich Main Security Office sought to centralize control. The logic was straightforward. If jurisdictional fights slowed operations, then centralize planning in a body that could coordinate across ministries. Centralization would reduce friction. It would standardize processes. It would create a single point of contact for transportation, security, and administration. The administrative goal was clarity. One schedule, one office, one signature. This drive towards centralized control is essential to understanding why Wannsee mattered. It was conceived as a place where coordination would be rationalized, where bureaucrats would agree on who did what and when. But centralization itself carried political costs. Ministries and agencies loathed giving up control. The Foreign Office, for instance, had to be involved when deportations crossed borders. The Interior Ministry had to sign off on changes to internal police procedures. The Justice Ministry had its own concerns about legal legitimacy. Securing assent was a matter of negotiation and compensation. Promises of authority in other areas, assurances about budgetary prerogatives, informal understandings about credit. These negotiations were often conducted in tones of polite professionalism, with cigarettes passed across desks and cognac shared after long meetings. The sensory detail, ashtrays filling, the bitter taste of drink on the tongue, belies the cruelty of the outcomes those conversations produced. The machinery of secrecy also became a practical problem. How to conceal the true nature of actions from international observers, from domestic critics, from the general public? Euphemisms multiplied: resettlement, special treatment, labor deployment. Official documents were purposefully opaque. Conferencing rooms used coded language. Staff were sworn to confidentiality. But secrecy had logistical consequences. Fewer participants were briefed on operations. Central authorities needed to compartmentalize knowledge, and local functionaries received only the bare minimum to accomplish their piece of the plan. That fragmentation made error more likely, but it also allowed the planners a level of plausible deniability. When something went wrong, those at the top could claim ignorance. When there was success, the field officers received the credit. The involvement of civilian institutions widened the net of culpability. Ministries of transport, finance, justice, and agriculture all had to play roles, issuing permits, allocating funds, vetting exemptions, requisitioning wagons. Corporations were sometimes complicit, providing vehicles, fuel, or infrastructure. The private sector's contribution blurred lines between public policy and commercial operations. Engineers who designed shunting yards, clerks who scheduled freight, contractors who built holding facilities, each had a hand in the system, whether knowingly or coerced. The smell of grease in a locomotive depot became part of a larger sensory world where commerce and cruelty intertwined. Resistance to coordination also took bureaucratic forms. Some lawyers attempted to challenge the legality of certain orders. Some diplomats refused to certify that deportees were criminals. Some clerks simply delayed. Those efforts were rarely enough to halt the momentum. but they complicated implementation and sometimes forced planners to find alternate routes. The existence of such internal opposition reveals that the system was neither monolithic nor inevitable. It had fault lines that, when exploited, could crack its smooth operation. Communication with occupied territories introduced another layer of complexity. Language barriers, inconsistent record-keeping, and varying local practices. A form that was standard in Berlin might be meaningless in a provincial Polish office. Municipal registries might be handwritten in Cyrillic script or in local dialects. Translation, transcription, and reconciliation of records became logistical nightmares. Imagine a clerk squinting at a parish register by lamplight, trying to match a name against a typed list from the capital. Those human moments, eyes squinting, a pen pausing over paper, could delay a train, or they could create the time needed for escape. Finally, there was the human resource problem. Moving and detaining people requires staff, police, guards, drivers, clerks, cooks for temporary camps. The war drained manpower. As soldiers were needed at the front, the pool of available functionaries shrank. The regime responded by recruiting auxiliaries from occupied populations and by redirecting personnel from civilian roles. Each recruitment decision carried local social consequences. Bringing in collaborators often exacerbated local tensions and created deeper moral wounds that would persist long after the war. All these practical problems, transport, jurisdiction, finance, secrecy, manpower, were technical in nature, but technical problems do not exist in a moral vacuum. Each solved difficulty represented a step toward making mass murder possible on a national scale. The daily banality of stamping papers, allocating wagons, and drafting circulars turned into the scaffolding of atrocity. The sensory details remain. The smell of ink, the weight of stamped paper, the clatter of a typing machine, the creak of office chairs as men leaned back to smoke and argue. Those details are the threads that stitch small administrative acts to the vast tapestry of genocide. As winter approached in 1941 and 1942, the planners in Berlin saw the logic of centralizing coordination more clearly than ever. The technical obstacles could be overcome with clear lines of command, shared documentation, and assigned responsibilities. They believed they had the means to make the machinery run smoothly. What remained was the political work of securing assent, the practical work of requisitioning rail cars, and a moral blankness to proceed. The stage for a conference, calm, organized, and administrative, was being set. Men who called themselves officials were preparing to speak, not of battle plans or budgets, but of human lives scheduled like cargo. And so the question shifted from whether such coordination was possible to who would sit across the table to formalize it. The problem had been identified. The state's many gears needed to be synchronized. The solution, they thought, was a meeting that would make coordination lawful, tidy, and bureaucratically defensible. The next chapter will take us to that lakeside villa where, over coffee and in neat suits, officials would attempt to translate murderous intent into schedules, quotas, and signatures. Chapter 8. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of genocide. The first thing to know about Reinhard Heydrich is that he looked efficient. He moved like a man convinced that systems could solve everything. His hair was always neat. His uniform sat without wrinkle. His hands, when he wrote, made small, precise strokes on paper. To meet him was to meet an intelligence that felt practiced in calculation rather than passion. But beneath that ice-cool efficiency was a moral void that could be filled with plans. Plans that were meticulous, cold, and terrible. Heydrich did not shout. He drafted. He did not pace in public squares. He convened committees. And for a regime that wanted not only hatred but order, he offered both, method and momentum. Heydrich's rise was not accidental. He had proved himself in the shadowlands of power, in corridors where secret policing and intelligence work intertwined. He was a master organizer, the kind of mind that delights in paperwork the way some men delight in battle strategy. His early career in the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence arm of the party, had taught him how to convert suspicion into dossiers and suspicion into action. He understood the power of records. Names on lists became levers. When he looked at a population, he saw columns and rows waiting to be filled. Where others saw people, he saw fields to be managed. By the time he assumed greater responsibility in the late 1930s and early 1940s, Heydrich had developed a practical and sinister credo. The state should not hesitate to use its machinery to eliminate perceived threats. He trusted bureaucracy. He trusted experts. He trusted the architecture of administration to do what emotion and violence could not: make atrocity predictable and repeatable. And he had a faith in collaboration, bringing in legal minds, diplomats, railway officials, and municipal clerks, because he understood that the modern state's power lay not only in its guns but in its paperwork. When one tries to understand how the Holocaust moved from atrocity to administration, Heydrich stands at the center of that transformation. He was not the origin of anti-Semitic ideology, but he was the man who translated that ideology into a plan with timetables and transport lists. He grasped the troubling arithmetic of mass murder. If you spoke of millions, you needed railway cars, you needed schedules, you needed places where death could be performed away from the eyes of the world. He treated the problem as an administrative puzzle. The cruelty of seeing human beings as items to be scheduled was a cruelty born out of professional competence. The image of Heydrich in his office is sharp if you imagine it. Lamps casting a pool of light over maps, cigarette ash falling into a tray, a circle of aides taking notes as he dictates. He was a man who liked lines on paper to correspond with lines on the ground. He drew boxes around territories. He annotated regions with numbers of Jews, and he placed pins where transport hubs could be used. That image, ink, numbers, pins, has become emblematic of a bureaucrat's evil, the quiet desk that plans catastrophe as if it were a logistic exercise. Heydrich's personality had sharp edges. Colleagues described him as brilliant and ruthless, charismatic in a cold way that made subordinates eager to serve. He did not inspire with warmth. He inspired with competence. Men wanted to be near his projects because proximity to his office meant authority and advancement. In a system that rewarded results, Heydrich delivered. His energy was relentless. His mind moved quickly from concept to execution, and his patience for dissent was thin. He preferred action to debate. If you were inefficient in his presence, you felt it in the form of a terse memo or a clipped rebuke. If you were useful, you found your tasks entrusted with his confidence and with the tools to perform them. One of Heydrich's crucial contributions was organizational. He built networks. Not merely networks in the modern sense of people who know each other, but institutional linkages that tied the SS, police forces, intelligence services, and administrative ministries together in a new alignment of purpose. He created channels by which directives could flow and by which local offices could be held accountable to central plans. The genius, if one can use such a monstrous word, was to create a command architecture where hesitation would be costly and where following orders reliably produced results. The structure removed ambiguity. It made compliance easier and resistance more dangerous. Heydrich was also a man of language and euphemism. He preferred terms that sanitized and masked. He used phrases like special treatment, a bureaucratic cloak that made atrocities sound like administrative categories. In practice, these euphemisms functioned as instruments of concealment. They allowed him to brief ministers and diplomats in a tone that sounded technical rather than murderous. To ask for special handling for a population segment was to invite stamps and signatures rather than loud protest. The manipulation of language was as important to Heydrich as the manipulation of trains. Both made the killing movable within the ordinary frameworks of governance. Another critical axis of Heydrich's work was his relationship with Adolf Eichmann, a man whose talents lay in logistics. Heydrich recognized Eichmann's skill and made him the executor of many of the grim details: lists, transports, registrations. Eichmann could talk in timetables and wagon allocations the way a tailor measures cloth. With Heydrich's strategic vision and Eichmann's logistical craft, a dangerous partnership formed, one that bound strategy to supply lines and ideology to timetables. They were not mere administrators. Together, they were architects of a system that would discipline life into death. Heydrich's methods were not purely top-down. He also relied on the willingness of many to participate at various levels. He cultivated relationships with party officials, with the Foreign Office, with ministers who preferred to protect the state's image while enabling its operations. He wrote memos that flattered duties while imposing strict deadlines. He used incentives, the promise of authority, the implied threat of inertia, to ensure cooperation. His style combined carrot and stick. Organizational psychology became a tool of compliance. Men who might have objected felt instead the quiet pressure of careers to lose or gains to secure. Heydrich understood ambition and fear. He used both. But Heydrich's administrative genius concealed an ideological fervor that made him dangerous beyond the office. He was not a detached technocrat in the way a neutral engineer might be. He believed in the mission. He saw his tasks as necessary to secure the nation's future. That conviction made his tactics not merely efficient, but ruthless. Anyone who stood in the path of his plans was an obstacle to be removed. He justified means by ends. In his view, the state's survival outweighed the rights of individuals. That calculus, when paired with administrative precision, produced a lethal combination. Heydrich also recognized the importance of precedent. He looked at methods tested in the East, the Einsatzgruppen shootings, the Vans at Chelmno, and he asked, how can these be made more systematic, less visible, more manageable? He directed inquiries into methods that would conceal and expand killing. He convened people who could translate field improvisations into durable policy. If the East was a laboratory, Heydrich was the technician who read the experiments and proposed blueprints. He understood that to commit genocide at scale, one needed not only hatred but infrastructure, camps, rail links, administrative forms, and a legal frame that could be adjusted to permit abuse without obvious illegality. There were also political calculations. Heydrich knew how to navigate both the street-level apparatus and the upper circles of power. He could be brutal enough to frighten rivals, astute enough to charm superiors, and practical enough to present proposals that looked like solutions to complex problems. His rapport with certain ministries smoothed bureaucratic snags. His reputation as someone who could get results made it easier for ministers to sign off on measures because they believed the problems would be contained. The veneer of efficiency again acted as a moral anesthetic. When terrifying proposals arrive enclosed in tidy operational plans, they could be accepted more readily. Heydrich's demeanor at meetings was telling. He often preferred to brief in a calm, almost genial tone. The voice that outlines timetables for trains can be the same voice that signs transport lists for people. He treated questions of human fate as if they were scheduling conflicts. Imagine a room where the scent of coffee meets the smell of cigarette smoke. Men sit in chairs of polished wood. Maps lie on the table. A man with sharp features gestures to a rail line and asks, dispassionately, how many can be moved by Friday? It is this everyday ordinariness that makes the horror more devastating. Genocide decided over coffee and calendars. Heydrich's ambition also made him dangerous to other powerful figures. He collected enemies as he collected dossiers. His quick ascent worried rivals. His brutality attracted critics. Yet he maneuvered adroitly, leveraging competence to shield himself and the tasks he championed. His assassinated end, when agents attacked him in Prague in 1942, testifies to the danger he posed to many, both within and without Germany. Even that death, however, did not erase what he had put into motion. His organizational structures, his memos, his networks of cooperation remained, and others took up the tasks he had begun. Heydrich's impact on the policy that became the Holocaust is perhaps best understood in the way he reframed problems. He converted moral questions into managerial challenges, and managerial challenges into projects that required staffing, funding, and timelines. This reframing was more than rhetorical. It reshaped how officials thought about genocide. It suggested that mass murder was not an uncontrollable eruption, but a task like any other, a problem with inputs and outputs, measurable and improvable. That cognitive shift, viewing people as data points to be optimized, was one of the greatest crimes of modern administration. And yet, for all his efficiency, Heydrich relied on others to execute. He needed ministers, railway clerks, camp commandants, and mayors. He needed the willing and the coerced. He needed a state that could be bent into service. His genius was not in solitary action, but in stitching together disparate threads of an enormous bureaucracy so they would act in concert. That stitch work is a chilling lesson. When the machinery of governance is harnessed by malignant intent, ordinary functions become instruments of atrocity. As plans solidified in the winter and early spring of 1942, Heydrich's fingerprints were everywhere. He issued directives, he demanded reports, and he sought clarity on logistics, from who counted as Jewish to how many railcars would be available each week. His office prepared documents in a tone that masked the content with technical detail. He arranged meetings where the language of policy would obscure the moral abyss beneath. The Wannsee meeting, when it came, would be a continuation of his project, a table where men would align definitions, assign responsibilities, and put signatures to plans. Heydrich would not be there to perform theatrics. He would be there to ensure the engine of genocide ran on schedule. Even as his plans gained force, there were voices of doubt scattered here and there. Officers who worried about international reaction, officials who feared reputational damage, diplomats who felt unease at euphemisms. Heydrich often dismissed such hesitations as obstacles to be managed. He had a mind for overcoming resistance, compromise on minor points, insistence on operational clarity on major ones. He would trade authority in one realm for obedience in another, and thus secure the consent he needed. The moral cost of such trades was invisible on the paper he signed. It was visible later in the graves, and in the silence of communities emptied. Heydrich's story forces us to confront a bitter truth. Skill without conscience amplifies evil. Efficiency is desirable when it makes hospitals run or schools teach. It is monstrous when it makes murder easier. He exemplified how modern administration, ordered, rational, efficient, can be twisted into a machine that multiplies harm. His office teaches a lesson about responsibility that echoes into our time. That technical competence divorced from ethical reflection can produce results that civilization must never permit. As winter edged toward January 1942, Heydrich's plans reached a new phase. He had the maps. He had the lists. He had the men who would carry orders. He had, critically, the will to translate an ideological aim into administrative procedure. What remained was to gather the right people in the right room, to make coordination explicit, to reduce jurisdictional squabbles, to align railway timetables, to clarify who would sign what. The villa by the Wannsee would provide the table. The coffee would be poured. The pens would be ready. The question that lay under Heydrich's papers was not merely technical. It was moral. Could a civilized nation justify, among its papers and offices, plans to extinguish millions? Heydrich answered that question by design, not debate. He believed the state could, and should, do so if it thought it necessary. The next chapter brings us to that villa, to the meeting, to the signatures. It will show how the language of administration and the rhythm of procedure will be used to justify the unthinkable. Chapter 9. The Luxury Villa at Wannsee. The villa looks like a picture from a postcard. Pale stucco walls, tall windows catching the afternoon sun, a ribbon of frozen lake at its rear. From the outside, it is the sort of place that invites leisure. Wide steps leading to a portico, clipped hedges, a terrace with wrought iron chairs. But appearances are camouflage. The house is a stage, and on the morning that matters, everything about it is arranged to make the extraordinary seem ordinary. Men will arrive in overcoats, their breath steaming in the cold air. They will hang hats on pegs and smooth the lapels of their jackets. The sound of boots will be punctuated by the soft clink of cutlery, the murmur of attendants, the near silence of rooms built for conversation. It is precisely the domestic calm that makes what will happen inside its walls more terrifying. Walk through the front door and the world shifts. The smell of polished wood and pipe tobacco, the faint sweetness of cognac, the low murmur of a gramophone in the entrance hall. The interior is tasteful. Persian rugs muted by decades of footfall, oil portraits leaning into their gilt frames, upholstered chairs softened by use. There is the tactile warmth of leather under a hand, the cool of marble balustrades, the hum of central heating humming like a contented animal. Each object, an ashtray, a decanter, a tray of half-moons of sugar, competes with the larger silence. The sense that this is a place where civilized conversation happens, where polite men settle business over coffee. It is that civility the men will call upon to dress a crime in ordinary clothes. The villa is not empty. Staff move like small shadows in the background, their steps careful, hands carrying cups and plates. Listen, the soft clatter of porcelain, the whisper of napkins unfolding, the low scrape of a chair. The sensory world of a country house, steam rising from cups, the metallic tang of teaspoons, the faint perfume of citrus peel left in a bowl, will combine with another sound, the deliberate rustle of paper. That rustle is the sound of plans. It is the noise that will matter most. It is the prelude to signatures. On that morning, the path to the villa is a procession of names and roles. They arrive in cars, black sedans, and chauffeur-driven limousines, windows fogging with breath. They climb steps, straighten coats, and enter. Among them are men from ministries whose normal duties are bureaucracy, law clerks who draft opinions, railway officials who understand timetables, diplomats skilled in phrasing, police chiefs who know how to requisition manpower. There is the SS presence, quiet and precise. There are faces familiar to those who track the machinery of the regime, men who have learned to make orders look inevitable. Each guest carries a sensibility. The Foreign Office man speaks of protocol. The legal advisor worries about wording. The police commander thinks in manpower. The SS official thinks in outcomes. Together, they are an assembly of the state's varied gears, all meeting in a single house that tastes of civility, and that will be used, once the coffee is drunk, to couple murder with administration. This convergence of careers is important because it reveals the regime's method. Not a single hand imposing terror, but a network of offices, each contributing its piece. The villa functions as a node where the threads are to be tied. Outside, the lake is a sheet of glass. Inside, maps are affixed to the wall, inked with lines that mean routes and capacities. Portfolios are opened. Folders exhale the smell of lead pencil and typing paper. Men pass each other documents. Their fingers carry ink smudges that will not be easily washed away from memory. These physical traces, ink on a cuff, a smudge on a tie, are the literal residue of decisions that will manifest later in trains and in camps. The social choreography inside is precise. There is a ritual to such meetings, a polite exchange at the entrance, a handshake that is neither warm nor cold, the small clearing of throats that marks the first sentence. A servant pours coffee, a tray of biscuits circulates. There is the sound of spoons stirring, the click of a cup set down on a saucer. Conversation opens with small talk, weather, travel, even a thin joke about winter roads, so that the transition to business will be smooth. This is deliberate. Politeness lubricates the meeting. It allows men to talk about monstrous things without the awkwardness of the obvious. The ordinary becomes a veil. But there are micro-tensions. Watch the little gestures, a hand that lingers over a paper a beat too long, a glance exchanged between two men, the tightening of an eyelid when a name is read aloud. Some men arrange the packets before them with near-obsessive care. Others appear almost bored, as if the meeting were one duty among many. The variety of demeanor adds texture. Some are ideologues bristling with conviction. Some are technicians amused at a logistical puzzle. Some are politicians assessing the political cost. The differences matter because they determine which voices will be persuasive when disagreements come. Bureaucratic disputes are rarely dramatic. They are about wording, about who signs what, about whose responsibility is recorded on which sheet. Yet those tiny, pedantic fights shape lives on a scale no human should ever be able to imagine. The villa's furnishings amplify the scene. Heavy curtains cushion sound. The chairs incline to private conversation. The dining table is long and polished, its surface catching the light in strips. On the table lie maps folded like cloth napkins. Pins glint where train lines meet centers of population. A single clock ticks with a crisp, economic sound. Time here is both a schedule and a pressure. Men will refer to minutes as one might refer to a commodity. They will count lives in groupings, in columns. The devices of civil life, the clock, the ledger, will be turned today into the devices of death by the simplest of transitions, a signature. The list of attendees is significant not merely for who is present, but for what their presence implies about the reach of decisions. There are legal experts present whose job is to render prejudice into policyables. Their pens will shape exemptions, definitions, and categories. There are transport officials who understand the skeletal logistics of the Reichsbahn. Their knowledge will turn language into concrete timetables. There are representatives from the Interior Ministry who can translate an order into police actions. There are also those whose presence will make the event not a spontaneous rebellion, but an administrative act. Men who can authorize, men whose stamps on documents make action possible without additional debate. The composition of the room is the state laid bare: law, transport, police, finance, and the security apparatus in dialogue. Conversation in such rooms has rhythms. It starts with reports, figures read out in flat tones, the names of cities, the counts of people. Then it moves to definitions. Who counts as belonging to which category? The parsing of identity becomes a forensic exercise. Men cite ancestry, certificates of baptism, municipal records. They debate the contours of mixed marriages and the treatment of those who are partly Jewish by descent. The debates are clinical. They involve percentages and family trees drawn in margins. At the center of this pedantry is a monstrous question: who will be removed, and who will be deemed an exception? Legal technicalities become the scalpel guiding policy. A comma misplaced might mean the difference between safety and transport. The use of euphemism is particularly striking in that setting. Words like resettlement, special treatment, and relocation are employed with surgical cleanliness. They have the effect of making the unspeakable speakable. Men who might otherwise blush at brutality frame it as administration, tasks to be scheduled, quotas to be met, operations to be timed. The villa's decor supports that verbal sleight of hand. Polished surfaces reflect a polished language. The phrase, final solution, will soon be used not merely as rhetoric, but as a rubric that organizes action. The function of language here is not to conceal only from outsiders. It also anesthetizes those inside, permitting them to proceed with a kind of professional distance. Meals become pauses in the action. Food is served, subtle, efficient dishes that do not demand attention. A clear consommé, a modest roast coffee. Men eat with the practiced manners of those who have dined in many houses, never lingering on taste. Their conversation during meals can be dangerously banal. Small complaints about travel, an aside about a train delay, a joke about the weather. Yet these banalities are the veneer over which the business proceeds. The fork slides over a plate where decisions about people's lives are being sketched in ink. The whisper between bites, how many to allocate, is a phrase that should never be uttered over pastry. It will be. Then there is the matter of record-keeping. Somebody in the room takes notes, the secretary's pencil moving in small, unhurried circles on paper. That record will later become the most damning witness. A typed set of minutes, calm in tone, precise in numbers, listing names and positions, outlining the agreed steps. The mere existence of such documentation is an administrative sin made corporeal. It proves how ordinary this meeting is in form. Minutes, signatures, circulated drafts. The apparatus that provides governance, even in its most formal, benign sense, also produces the paperwork that will enable atrocity. Tension builds in small, bureaucratic ways. When a disagreement arises over the definition of who counts as Jewish, over exemptions for mixed marriages, over whether certain categories might be retained as laborers, voices lower, pens pause. A legal mind will argue from statute. A Foreign Office man will worry about international optics. An SS officer will speak of necessity. There is bargaining, a concession here, a retained prerogative there. These compromises, decided in gentle tones, are lethal. They make the plan practicable. They decide logistics. They allocate blame. The audience in the room is small, but their choices will ripple outward like concentric circles on a pond. Observe how men shield themselves from the moral implications. They speak in the language of problem-solving, capacity issues, transport allotment, administrative burden. These phrases act like buffers. The more technical the argument, the less one must look at the face of another human being. This psychological partitioning, turning persons into items, repeats itself throughout the day. It is a ritual of dissociation. Men in suits and medals will not need to imagine the shrieks at a station platform. They will imagine wagon counts, delivery times, the efficiency of escort detachments. And yet not everyone is wholly composed. Here and there, a hand trembles slightly as a cup is lifted. A throat clears a little too loudly. A face reddens with something more than the cold. Some attendees have seen killings firsthand. Some have read reports that cannot be fully sanitized. Their small bodily betrayals are human. They are traces that conscience exists but is catalogued and set aside. It is this human residue, the cough, the delayed intake of breath, that reveals how moral compromise is not absolute. It is negotiated, rationed, and compartmentalized. As the hours pass, decisions accumulate. Lines are drawn on maps. Categories are circled. Timetables are penciled in. Men who have no direct familiarity with trains begin to think in terms of departures and arrivals. Lawyers who have spent lives parsing statutes learn to think in terms of throughput. Police commanders calculate manpower and shifts. The meeting converts disparate knowledges into coordinated action. It is not a single brilliant man imposing his will. It is the convergence of many small competences, pooled and turned toward one objective. That convergence is what makes the meeting at the villa so dangerous. It demonstrates how ordinary expertise can be repurposed for extraordinary harm. The day closes with the soft clink of chairs pushed back, with coats refastened, with a cigarette stubbed in an ashtray. Men stand, exchange measured domestic pleasantries, and file back out into the cold. The lake behind the villa mirrors their retreat, still, reflective, as if it had absorbed nothing. But the record does not end when feet hit gravel. The minutes that will be typed, the memos that will be circulated, the signatures that will be affixed, these things will travel faster than the men. They will move into offices and onto trains. The villa itself remains a quiet witness, its rooms smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and coffee, its curtains drawn against the winter light. Outside, the soundscape is ordinary again. The distant rattle of a tram, the cry of a gull over the lake. The men have gone, but the map on the table is not forgotten. Pins remain where they were placed. Coffee rings sit on a leather folder. Ink dries on a page. The villa will go on, as storage and as house, and the small domestic trinkets will be returned to their places. But inside those envelopes and folders, a different order has been sketched. An administrative program that will turn suspicion and prejudice into schedules and signatures. The moral pivot of the villa is not spectacle. It is normalization. It is the way in which the language of governance, forms, stamps, signatures, makes atrocity feel like policy. It is the realization that when experts gather in a domestic room and trade in timetables and columns, the machinery of a modern state can be enlisted to extinguish whole populations without theatrics. The villa is the place where murder will be given the shape of an office agenda. As men step into their cars and drive away, watches ticking and steady, in different rhythm. The final inexplicable detail lodges in the air. A typed draft of minutes, folded and left on a side table, its ink hardly dry. It will be preserved, misfiled, saved. It will later become one of the clearest evidences of intention. At this moment, though, it is only paper on a table in a beautiful house by a frozen lake. The pens are capped. The chairs are empty. And yet the real meeting is not over. It has merely moved into the quiet work of implementation. The phone calls, the telegrams, the requisitions. The next chapter will move inside those telegrams and timetables. It will show how what was agreed in polite tones and over coffee translated into rail cars, into lists, into the architecture of killing. For now, the villa keeps its secrets beneath rugs and portraits, and the lake, patient and cold, reflects the pale sky like a silent witness waiting to be read. Chapter 10. The Wannsee Conference. Inside the meeting, 20 January 1942. The villa was unbearably ordinary for a crime of such scale. Imagine a winter light that slips across a table, catching a ring of silver and a smudge of ink, making them glitter like evidence. Imagine the faint steam rising from a cup of coffee, the scrape of a teaspoon on porcelain, the soft whisper of papers being unfurled. There was nothing theatrical about the room. There were no raised voices, no banners, no trumpets. The tone was domestic, so calm that the ordinary sounds of civility became a kind of camouflage for the extraordinary agenda. They sat in a tidy semicircle, not in battle formation, but in the posture of men who believed themselves to be officers of routine. Their coats were hung, their hats set aside. Some loosened ties. Some kept their gloves on until they sat. In the quiet, you could hear the small mechanical noises of a meeting, the rustle of paper, the click of a pen cap, the faint clearing of a throat. A servant placed a plate of biscuits on the table. A man reached, hesitated, and took one. There was a casualness to such gestures that makes the scene more chilling, because politeness and murder shared the same surface. The chair at the head did not belong to a tyrant who needed to roar. The chair belonged to a man who preferred forms and figures, the kind of authority that imposes order by clarifying responsibility. He presented a plan. He presented a map. He presented a moral inversion wrapped in logic. The room listened as if to a briefing about shipments, not about human lives. And that was the point. They spoke in the language of administration because administration was the veil that would allow atrocity to pass as policy. When a man reads numbers into a ledger, a nation can be turned into a spreadsheet. When signatures are affixed, decisions are made irreversible. The documents on the table smell faintly of ink and oil and pipe tobacco. They are typed with the precise, clinical neatness of bureaucracy. They list groups, categories, and regions. They enumerate communities not as peoples with faces and names, but as entries, towns, counts, logistical notes. To look at them is to feel the cold arithmetic of planning. Columns of totals, references to rail connections, suggestions about exemptions. Each line is a hinge. Each number is, for someone, a last count of hours. The tactile experience of flipping a page in that room could not be separated from the moral weight that lay behind the words. Conversation in the villa moves in small calibrations. It begins with reports, numbers from regions, approximations, the current state of ghettos and registrations. Voices are measured. When someone speaks, he does so with a tone that suggests duty rather than malice. Yet the content bites like cold steel. They discuss totals of people to be affected. They parse definitions. Who counts as Jewish by ancestry? Whose marriages remain exceptions? Whether certain professionals should be retained for labor. These are not hypothetical debates. They are the merciless arithmetic of inclusion and exclusion. Each clause discussed will determine whether a family remains or is scheduled for removal. One of the most unsettling features of the meeting is how the men treat legal and moral problems as technical ones. When an objection arises, a diplomat wondering aloud about the reaction of neutral governments, a legal advisor questioning the precision of a definition, the answer offered is procedural. Adjust the phrasing, create an exemption, schedule a consultation. There is no moral reflection, only the engineering of acceptability. The room gropes for wording that both achieves intent and mitigates embarrassment. Euphemism is the lubricant: resettlement, special treatment, evacuation. The phrases sound like railway terms until you imagine their consequence. The dynamics between speakers are precise and telling. Some men are practiced rhetoricians, comfortable with public nuance, trained to think in the diplomatic idiom. Others are technicians, whose authority rests in timetables and capacities. Some are legalists, who care for clauses and commas because they know how law legitimizes. And then there are those whose roles are blunt instruments, officers who measure manpower and security in blunt nouns. When they speak, they do not soften. They propose practicalities: how many trains per week, carriage allotments, how to schedule guards, where escorts are needed. Their voice is that of logistics, solving the question of throughput. Smaller sensory details anchor the humanness of the room. A pair of fingers taps nervously at a sheet when a contentious clause is read. A man lifts his cup and sips, then sets it down with a faint tremor. A pen scratches, and then pauses, as if the hand that wields it momentarily recognizes the import of its stroke. There are folded notes passed discreetly, the squeak of shoe leather as someone shifts in a chair, the clack of a typewriter outside the room where a secretary creates the minutes. These textures are proof that history happened in flesh and nerve, that enormous decisions do not escape the small betrayals of the body. As the meeting advances, the conversation turns to practical mechanisms. Railway men draw diagrams in shorthand. They circle junctions and list capacities. Their hands move over the map as if measuring time itself. How long from a provincial siding to a central camp? How many cattle wagons could be requisitioned without disrupting troop movements? How to prioritize slots. The vocabulary is technical: tonnage, rotation, availability. But each term translates to human movement. A slot on a timetable becomes a family's journey. A wagon is repurposed from coal hauling to human transport. In the room, efficiency and cruelty braid together. There are moments of friction. A legal expert insists that categories must be precise to avoid internal contradictions. An interior ministry official argues about exceptions for those in mixed marriages. A foreign office representative furrows his brow at potential diplomatic fallout. These points of resistance are not moral crusades. They are negotiations of risk and optics. Officials are calculating contingency. They worry about reaction, internally and externally. Not because they feel empathy for victims, but because embarrassment or diplomatic entanglement might complicate the execution of plans. The question is always how to carry out the intent while minimizing obstacles, interruptions, and potential backlash. A striking strategy in the meeting is the desire to tie loose ends with paperwork. If something might be controversial, draft an enabling clause. If a category is ambiguous, require local certification. If a town's registry is incomplete, instruct a supplementary census. The orientation is methodical. The planners regard ambiguity as a solvable data problem. They imagine that with the right forms, signatures, and stamps, every social complication can be standardized. This belief in paperwork as an instrument of power is what turns vagueness into authorization. A stamped form makes transgression procedural, and a procedure is harder to resist. Throughout, there is an air of efficiency. Orders are made to be repeatable. They test the mental model against scales. If X number can be moved from region in 1 week, how many can be processed in a month from multiple regions? That arithmetic drives the decisions. The group debates capacity not as a moral limit, but as a production parameter. The question that repeats is technical: how to maximize throughput while minimizing disruption to other wartime functions. This is the moment when genocide is rendered as a manufacturing challenge, and modernity's tools, schedules, supply chains, accounting, become its instruments. The room also rehearses contingencies. What if a railway line is bombed? What if local resistance forms? What if local administrators refuse to cooperate? The responses are step by step, reroute, requisition military police, replace non-cooperative officials, impose penalties. Each contingency list is a manual for circumvention. In that manual, the human variable is treated as something to be engineered around. Resistance is not an invitation for moral debate. It is an engineering problem to be solved through authority and force. Yet there are small human resistances within the meeting itself. Occasionally, a voice softens, a hand lingers in the air. A participant seeks to narrow the category of whom to include. These moments do not derail the agenda, but they humanize it, reminding the listener that not everyone in the room is identical in temperament or conviction. Some are cautious, some are zealous, some are ambiguous. But the meeting's architecture is designed to synthesize these temperaments into coherent action. It is less about unanimous enthusiasm than about administrative convergence. As the day wears on, the minutes accumulate. A secretary's typewriter ticks in processional cadence, a machine translating conversation into a document that will outlive the men gathered around the table. These minutes are careful, almost clinical in tone. They record definitions, agreed procedures, lists of categories that will be used across territories. The textual ordinary of the minutes is their most damning feature. Calm prose that masks the horror it organizes. When typed and distributed, the minutes will travel into ministries and local offices as a kind of instruction manual. They will turn what was discussed into what must be done. At certain points, the meeting reaches the matter of exemptions. The conversation turns to the fate of those in so-called mixed marriages, to those critical to war industries, to non-Jewish dependents. The room negotiates lists of exceptions not from a posture of compassion, but from practical necessity. Labor needs, diplomatic complications, and the desire to maintain some semblance of legal formality shape who receives temporary reprieves. These reprieves are fragile and contingent. They are, in effect, a form of bureaucratic triage, an exercise in prioritizing targets rather than protecting persons. Even as policy concretizes, the personal remains present in haunting ways. Participants mention towns and villages, names that to them are coordinates, to others are homes. A pause follows the pronunciation of a familiar town's name. A man closes his eyes for a moment, perhaps picturing a map, perhaps something else. Then the sentence continues. This tiny breathing space hints at the fact that the men are not automatons. They are human, capable of nuance, even of doubt. But the human capacity is compartmentalized. Compassion, if present, is contained and regulated. It does not translate into refusal. By the time the meeting reaches its end, the mechanics of execution have been sketched. Timetables will be drafted. Lists will be circulated. Local offices will be instructed to prepare registries and resources. The plan crystallizes into next steps, each of which will cascade down a chain of subordinate actors: provincial administrators, municipal clerks, railway schedulers, police detachments. The villa has provided a template for action, and the apparatus of the state will now, in 1,000 smaller acts, make those templates operational. They finish the meeting with the worn civility with which they began. Handshakes, small phrases of thanks, the exchange of business cards. Men put on coats, step into the cold air, and their breath fogs in the winter sun as if life were unchanged. But life is changed. In ink and in instruction, a decision has been made that will reach into millions of homes. The minutes will be filed, copied, and sent. The signatures on a document will become timetables at railheads and lists in town halls. That quiet domesticity, cups drained and chairs straightened, belies the mechanism now set in motion. As the men depart the villa, walkways crunching with frost, a single page remains on the table like a dropped leaf, the draft of the minutes, bearing the faint impression of a pen. It will survive long after coats have been mothballed and boots silenced. It will be discovered, later, as a legal and moral witness to what transpired in a room where civility and annihilation sat side by side. The ink will not wash away. The paper will not lie. Outside, lakeside silence resumes. The world goes on in its ordinary rhythms: trams, vendors, a child's shout. But under that rhythm lies the echo of what was arranged inside. The decision, made in calmness, will travel in stamp, in telegraph, in train schedule. The most terrible part is not that the plan was conceived. It is that it could be translated into the mundane operations of state. And the question that hovers as the villa's doors close is not merely technical. When a civilization can plan annihilation with such administrative care, what force remains to stop it? The answer will be tested in the months that follow, in timetables and platforms, in the hands of clerks, and in the faces of those ordered onto wagons. The next chapter will follow the man who took these pages and turned them into action, tracking signatures to telegraphs, lists to freight cars, discussion to departure. Chapter 11. Adolf Eichmann, the engineer of death. He kept lists the way a tailor keeps measurements: neat, folded, precise. There was a kind of craft to his bureaucratic neatness, an obsession with order that translated into terrifying efficiency. Adolf Eichmann did not stand on platforms issuing orders to crowds. He did not drive the trucks or pull the triggers. He sat at desks, made phone calls, drafted telegrams, and compiled registers. If the Holocaust had an operations room, Eichmann built its paperwork. His contribution was technical, logistical, intimate, and in its intimacy, profoundly destructive. Imagine a small office lit by a single lamp at night, the scratch of a fountain pen, the soft click of rubber stamps, the rustle of typed pages. Eichmann moved through such rooms like a man at ease. He understood systems. He loved forms. He delighted in the architecture of a schedule. Where other men saw victims, he saw data points, names, ages, occupations to be slotted into a transport list. That very reduction, the translation of life into an entry on a page, was central to his power. People call him an organizer. A more accurate word might be technician, someone who translated genocidal intent into trains, wagons, and timetables. His rise within the machinery of the Reich Main Security Office was not merely about rank, but about aptitude. Eichmann had an unusual facility for details. He could memorize railway timetables, estimate wagon capacities, and translate regional registries into usable transport manifests. Those skills made him indispensable. When a plan required precision, how many cars could be requisitioned on a given week? How many men were available to escort a convoy? Which sidings could be used without disrupting troop movements? Eichmann had answers. He was a bridge between the conceptual planners and the logistical realities. For the planners, that bridge was everything. Eichmann's office smelled of paper and tobacco. He kept notebooks with shorthand lists, notebooks that would later become evidence, then testimony. He spoke in practicalities. In meetings, he would not linger on ideology. He asked questions that mattered to execution. How many can be moved on Monday? Which jurisdictions will sign off? Who needs an exemption for essential labor? The questions sound prosaic because they are prosaic. Yet it is precisely the prosaic that made mass murder possible. Eichmann's talent was to make the monstrous administrable. He also understood the currency of legitimacy. He cultivated relations with municipal registrars, with synagogue clerks who had kept birth and marriage records, with police chiefs who held lists of residents. He knew how to extract data from institutions that had never been designed for killing. He treated registries and parish ledgers as raw material. A birth record, in his hands, became an instrument, a date that would determine belonging, an annotation that would fix a person's fate. The tactile reality, parchment, ink, folded pages, was transformed into machinery. Eichmann turned everyday records into tools of exclusion. Part of his method was to delegate complexity. Eichmann set up units, offices, and sub-offices that specialized in different tasks: registration, transport coordination, liaison with foreign offices, liaison with railway authorities. He understood that a centralized mind could not operatively manage every town. Instead, he created a network that mirrored business logistics. Each node had a function, a budget, a schedule. Those nodes communicated through telegrams and teletypes, through couriers and phone calls. The hum of the system, its steady chatter, was not loud. It was a low, bureaucratic noise, the ring of a telephone, the clack of a teleprinter, the sigh of a typesetter. That hum carried orders from the center to the periphery. Eichmann's charisma was not theatrical, but administrative. Colleagues described him as energetic, restless, oddly personable in ways that disarmed suspicion. He could be affable over coffee, jotting notes, then return to a conversation about timetables, as if nothing had changed. There are testimonies of him smiling when recounting logistical successes, how a transport had been arranged without disrupting troop movements, and smiling is a detail that chills when measured against the consequences. His effect was part of his power, a genial efficiency that made compliance seem natural, even reasonable. He was also a craftsman of euphemism. Eichmann used and perfected terms that softened brutality, resettlement, evacuation, special handling. By cloaking movement in administrative language, he reduced resistance. Documents described trains departing for the east rather than carrying people to death. That linguistic slippage mattered. It allowed officials at every level to see their role as technical rather than moral. If a clerk filed a form that read resettlement, it felt like routine. Eichmann understood that paper could anesthetize conscience. The mechanics of deportation became his workshop. He learned to estimate capacity. How many people could be crammed into a cattle car if space was conserved? How many trains could be looped through a scheduling window without disrupting military logistics? How many days could people be transported without food before collapse? These calculations are grotesque in their subject, but precise in their technique. Weights, volumes, rotation rates. Eichmann and his aides kept careful notes. He tested schedules, adjusted for delays, and reworked manifests when bombs interrupted a rail line. He treated disruptions as solvable problems, not moral crises. The language of engineers replaced the language of ethics. Coordination with foreign and semi-independent authorities was another of his strengths. When deportations crossed frontiers, Eichmann wrote to consulates, negotiated with local administrators, and told bureaucratic consent. He understood that the state's reach depended on cooperation. In places where cooperation existed, transports ran smoother. Where resistance or confusion occurred, delays multiplied. Eichmann's approach to obstacles was methodical. Paperwork, persuasion, and sometimes pressure. He could cajole a reluctant official with plausible rationalizations. He could also threaten administrative consequences. His diplomacy was cold and efficient, part pleading, part command. Yet Eichmann was not a mere automaton of paperwork. He traveled to inspect operations, to see how transports were conducted at provincial stations, to check whether guards followed directives. When he visited a ghetto or a collection point, he watched the local mechanics closely, how people were lined up, how lists were read, whether children were separated with particular ruthlessness. He took notes. He made adjustments. These inspections were part quality control, part demonstration of authority. The sensory memory of such a visit is stark. The whistle of a locomotive, the clatter of open wagon doors, the hush of waiting crowds, the rustle of paper as names were read. Eichmann watched those scenes like a supervisor assessing a production line, stoic and clinical. Another element of his practice was the relentless pursuit of paperwork that closed loopholes. He insisted on bolstering records with supplementary documentation, proof of ancestry, certificates of baptism, testimony from community leaders. Where a local registry was incomplete, he sent teams to reconstruct family trees. This obsession with documentation had a double effect. It tightened control and made the process feel lawful. A stamped ledger page made action defensible in the bureaucratic sense. It made refusal to act legally precarious. Eichmann exploited that legalism. He used it to push decisions through the machinery of state. He also excelled at timing. Transport windows were precious. Eichmann learned how to prioritize slots, how to synchronize collection orders with the arrival of trains, how to minimize the idle time between loading and departure. That timing reduced opportunities for escape. A family that had an hour to flee might have been able to slip away. A family given 10 minutes could not. The cruel efficiency of scheduling converted minutes into life and death multipliers. Eichmann's mastery of time was as central as his mastery of forms. Eichmann's role extended beyond logistics into the moral economy of the Holocaust. He advised on who should be kept for labor and who was to be deported. His office compiled lists of professionals, technicians, engineers, people considered valuable to the war effort. Those persons were sometimes spared temporarily, parceled out as a resource. This cold calculus, deploy human beings according to perceived utility, reveals how Eichmann's thinking bound genocide to economic and military goals. It was not only ideology, it was calculation, an effort to extract value before destruction. Yet his system was not infallible. Local chaos, partisan attacks, Allied bombing, and the simple stubbornness of humanity sometimes disrupted schedules. There were miscounts, delayed trains, names entered incorrectly. These failures fed Eichmann's obsession with contingency planning, redundant lists, cross-checked registries, backups for railway slots. He perfected forms of redundancy that insulated the operation from many practical failures. The result was a resilient system. If one route failed, another could be opened. Eichmann designed redundancy into the machinery of killing. Beyond the operational details, Eichmann's story raises painful moral questions about ordinary people and extraordinary crimes. After the war, during his capture, trial, and execution, he famously described himself as a mere functionary, just following orders, a cog in the machine. That defense provoked outrage and philosophical debate about responsibility. To call him merely a cog is both true and dangerously misleading. He was not forced to invent the system. He chose to build and refine it. He was not conscripted into moral blindness. He cultivated it through language, procedure, and practice. His technical skill made possible crimes that would have been logistically intractable otherwise. Eichmann's personal life gives further texture to the man and the machine. Colleagues spoke of his persistence and impatience. Friends noted his steadfast attention to detail. He kept diaries, travel logs, and appointment books, ephemeral proofs of normal administrative routines. He maintained the illusion of normalcy. Family dinners, official receptions, meetings with colleagues. The dissonance between domestic normality and public atrocity is striking. A man who enjoyed routine family life by night, who scheduled transports by day. The smells and textures of his domestic world, boiled coffee, wool coats, the scratch of a pen at dinner, stand in brutal contrast to the sights and sounds he orchestrated in stations and camps. As the machinery of deportation unfolded across Europe, Eichmann's office swelled with clerks and teleprinters. He delegated steadily, training new cadres to perform the same tasks he had made routine. The expansion of his network meant that the load did not rest on a single pair of shoulders. That diffusion was strategic. It distributed responsibility and increased capacity. The larger the team, the more normalized the tasks became. The men who typed manifests, sealed envelopes, and stamped forms often described their work in mechanical terms: delivery, dispatch, archive. The distancing language dulled moral reflexes. Eichmann's competence shielded him for some time, but it did not protect him forever. After the war, he fled, first to neighboring countries, finally to a distant life in exile where he lived under an assumed name. Yet the very paperwork he loved would betray him. Investigators and survivors assembled records and witnesses. The tendrils of his operations, lists, telegrams, train manifests, became the net that captured him. Papers that once enabled deportation became evidence at trial. The tactile quality of paper, inked names, stamped dates, folded registers, transformed from instruments of killing into proof of intent. His trial, years later, forced public attention on the mechanics he had perfected. In court, survivors read names from manifests, Railway timetables were produced as evidence. The hum of teleprinters echoed in the memory of jurors. Eichmann's defense, that he had been a bureaucrat following orders, collapsed under the weight of documentation and testimony that traced decision through his office to stations and platforms. The trial laid bare what the villa had begun, the way administrative language and logistics turned hatred into action. Even so, the story resists simple moral absolutes. Eichmann's case asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of responsibility in modern administrative states. At what point does technical expertise become complicity? How do we reckon with a person who is neither ideologue in oratory nor reluctant executor, but a skilled functionary who preferred the spreadsheet to the speech? These are not rhetorical puzzles for historians alone. They are warnings about how organizations can turn competence into cruelty. As the deportations continued and the network Eichmann built expanded into the wider architecture of camps and death factories, his work shifted from invention to maintenance. The question moved from whether Europe could be emptied to how quickly and quietly it could be done. Eichmann answered by refining processes, smoothing frictions, and ensuring that the calendars, wagons, and lists continued to move. His engineering did not end at the table. It extended to the platform, to the custody of records, to the minutiae that made transformation possible. And yet even the most efficient machine has limits. Allied advances, partisan disruptions, the collapse of supply lines, and the sheer human unpredictability of war would begin to fray the system. The very success that Eichmann engineered, turning genocide into transport schedules, would later become vulnerable to the chaos of a collapsing Reich. But by then, the damage had been done. The trains had carried away entire communities. Forms had been stamped. Signatures were on files that would, in other hands, become evidence of guilt. The next chapter will follow the chilling consequence of these transports, the creation and operation of the death camp network, the grim architecture where logistical design met industrial murder. There, the schedules Eichmann perfected would meet the furnaces and the chambers that finalized the work he had helped to start. Chapter 12. The trains begin to move. It begins with a whistle, a sound so ordinary it could belong to any day, any town, any railway morning. But this whistle is different. It isn't announcing arrival. It is announcing disappearance. The steam that rises from the engine stacks curls into the cold air, like a ghost already forming. The platform is not crowded with luggage or hopeful chatter. It is crowded with the quiet, strained breathing of people who have been told they're being resettled, that they're going to work, that they're being moved for their own good. Lies spoken in official tones are like fences. They keep panic contained long enough for the machinery to operate. Imagine a siding at dawn. Dew settles on the rails, and the steel glints faintly in the first touch of light. The cars waiting on the track are not passenger coaches. They are cattle wagons, wooden, sealed, with narrow slits for air. They smell of old hay, sweat from animals long since gone, and the sharp bite of cold iron. The doors are heavy. When they slam shut, the sound rings with a finality that echoes into a future the people inside cannot yet imagine. The platform boards creak under the weight of boots, soldiers, railway workers, police clerks. Their uniforms vary, their roles differ, but they share an unspoken understanding. They are here to move numbers, not families. They have lists. They have timetables. They have to keep a schedule. A family stands near a wagon. A man clutches a small suitcase. A woman whispers to a child whose eyes are wide and uncomprehending. Someone has brought a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Someone else holds a metal tin with coins, thinking money might still matter. People carry keys to their homes, because surrendering a key feels like surrendering their identity. Some carry photos. Some carry nothing. They do not know what to take because they do not know what awaits. The confusion is deliberate. When people do not know the truth, they cannot resist in time. Officials stand near the lists. The lists are typed, neat, columns aligned. Names, dates of birth, professions, addresses. To read such a page feels clinical, bureaucratic. To live on such a page is to become vulnerable to a flick of a pen. Officials check names against faces quickly, without speaking. A nod here, a gesture there. A person becomes confirmed for removal by a gesture, so small it barely moves the air. A stamp thuds onto a page. One sound among dozens. Unremarkable except that each stamp is the sound of a life crossing from one world into another. The boarding begins with commands delivered in low voices. There is no need for shouting. The presence of rifles communicates enough. People step forward slowly, climbing into the wagons. They press close together, the wood rough beneath their palms, the air already warm with breath. The guards close the doors. The lock slides into place with an iron click. That is the moment the outside world ends for those inside. The noise outside, the scrape of boots, the hiss of steam, the shifting weight of the engine, grows distant. Inside it is dark. A sliver of light comes through a narrow slit. Someone touches the wall to steady themselves and feels splinters. Someone whispers a prayer. Someone begins to cry in silence. To understand what happens next, you must understand scale. Trains did not move a few hundred people. They moved thousands. Not once, not twice, but every week from towns across Europe. The timetables were drawn in Berlin, but the loading took place in places where neighbors recognized each other. A teacher saw his former students. A shopkeeper saw the family who bought bread from him every morning. Recognition made the silence heavier. The train begins to move. The wheels clatter, slow at first, then gathering rhythm. The track stretches out like a sentence with no punctuation. Inside, the rocking motion is disorienting. There is no place to sit. There is barely space to breathe. The air becomes stale. The cold of the morning fades into a heat made by human bodies pressed too close. Someone faints. Someone tries to fan air toward them, but there is nowhere for new air to come from. The train continues. They do not stop often. When they do, it is usually to allow faster trains to pass. Military transports, freight supplies, trains carrying soldiers. In those moments, the world outside continues, unaware or unwilling to see. A child presses an eye to a crack in the wood and sees farmland rolling past, trees, houses, lives going on untouched. The cruelty of that view is sharp. Life so ordinary, so familiar, so unreachable. Thirst becomes a force. Water is rationed, if present at all. People try to catch snow through the slits in the wagon if the train passes through winter country. The snow melts instantly on their tongues, not because it is warm inside the wagon, but because desperation turns even the smallest relief into something bright and overwhelming. Hunger gnaws slower. It does not consume, it erodes. But thirst strikes like a hammer. This journey is not measured in hours. It is measured in suffering. Days blur. The smell becomes overwhelming. Sweat, fear, waste. Privacy disappears. Dignity dissolves. People lean against one another to stay upright. They try to keep children calm, try to maintain order in a place where order has been replaced by survival instinct. Those who are strong try to help the weak. Those who are weak try to hold on to something, memory, prayer, a hand. Meanwhile, at railway junctions, the administrative machine moves with cold efficiency. Telegraph lines hum with messages confirming departures and expected arrivals. Schedulers adjust timetables to allow trains loaded with human beings to merge seamlessly into the complex orchestration of war logistics. Freight trains carrying coal and weapons intersect with trains carrying entire towns of people. The machinery of a modern state is indifferent to cargo. The schedule matters. The movement matters. Efficiency matters. Humanity does not. The guards accompanying the train ride in separate cars. They smoke, joke, play cards. Some talk about their families. Some talk about promotions. A few look uneasy, but unease rarely translates into action. Obedience is habit. Habit is comfort. Comfort is easier than conscience. The rhythm of the rails covers doubt. Stations along the route tell a story without words. Some station masters turn away. Others linger, watching. Some write reports that will later become evidence. Some pretend not to understand what they see. Ordinary people look away. Some look too long and are changed by it forever. As the train approaches its destination, the landscape subtly alters. The tracks diverge and disperse. There are fences, watchtowers, smokestacks, buildings arranged with cold geometry. The smell in the air changes. It carries a note of something burned, something chemical. The train slows, then stops. Silence holds for a moment, the kind of silence that feels like a breath held too tightly. Then the doors open. Light floods in. Shouts fill the air. Men in uniforms, different uniforms now, stand at the ready. They shout instructions. People stumble from the wagons, eyes blinded by light after days in darkness. The ground underfoot is uneven. They try to gather belongings, but they are pushed forward. Their names are never spoken again. They are now transport arrivals, a term that belongs to ledgers, not families. The selection happens quickly. A gesture of a hand decides who lives for the moment and who dies. The strong are sent one way, the weak another. Doctors in white coats stand beside officers in black uniforms. Their movements are practiced. They do not need to think. Their bodies remember the motions. They do not examine. They categorize. The elderly, the sick, the very young, those who cannot work, are moved toward a place they are told is for bathing. They are told to undress. They are told to breathe deeply. They are told lies that will hold their fear still long enough for the process to continue smoothly. The train is emptied. Its silence remains. The wagons still smell of sweat and humanity. The doors close. The train will not be cleaned. It will return to gather more. This is the moment the machinery becomes visible not as planning or policy, but as reality. The documents typed in Berlin, the schedules calculated by Eichmann's office, the signatures inked at Wannsee. Here they materialize as human suffering and death. A child who cried in the wagon stops crying because there is no more breath. A woman who clutched a photograph of her mother drops it. A man who tried to stay strong for his family stands alone in a line and does not understand why. But to understand the trains is to understand something even more terrible. They did not stop. Not when news traveled. Not when rumors spread. Not when diplomats raised questions. Not when letters reached neutral countries. Not when people disappeared from cities so quickly that shadows grew larger than streets. The trains continued because once a system is built to run, it runs until it is broken. A timetable is a promise, and this timetable promised death. The men who scheduled these trains measured distances and fuel and labor. They did not measure tears. They did not measure love. They did not measure the silence that would fall over entire towns where once there had been laughter. The train tracks ran through fields, through forests, through cities that will never forget, even if they tried. The iron rails rusted over time, but rust cannot erase memory. The sleepers, the wooden beams beneath the rails, absorbed sound. They absorbed vibration. They absorbed history. The next chapter will step beyond arrival and into the place that awaited at the end of those tracks, the camps built not for imprisonment, but for the elimination of life itself. Where the trains ended, the factories of death began. Chapter 13. The Death Camps, Factories of Annihilation. The first impression was order. Not chaos, not frenzy, not the wild brutality of spontaneous violence. Order. The camps were designed to look like functioning institutions. Fences in straight lines, barracks arranged in grids, chimneys rising against the sky. Men in uniforms walked with purposeful strides. Signs were posted. Procedures were followed. There was a timetable for everything. To someone arriving, without knowing what these places truly were, there might have been a flicker of belief that this was temporary housing, a holding facility, a work site. That flicker lasted only seconds. The illusion dissolved fast. The smell made sure of that. Smoke that was not what smoke. A heavy, sweet, unforgettable odor that carried in the wind. It coated the tongue, clung to clothing, embedded itself in hair. It was the smell of burning bodies, though most people arriving did not yet understand that. They only knew something was wrong in a way that made the skin tighten and the heart twist. The camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, Auschwitz-Birkenau, were not accidents of war. They were engineered, designed, calculated. The architecture was not improvised. It was planned the way a factory is planned, with efficiency in mind, with workflow and throughput and capacity calculations. To call them camps is almost a tragic euphemism. They were slaughterhouses disguised as relocation centers. When the trains arrived, the process began instantly. There was no moment offered to breathe, to collect belongings, to speak. People were shouted into lines, men on one side, women and children on another. The movement was continuous. Stopping broke the machinery, and the machinery could not stop. Guards with rifles and dogs stood at angles designed to push the flow forward. A gesture of a gloved hand decided fate. A slight tilt of the wrist sent a person either to the line labeled work or to the line that led directly to death. The decision took less than a second. The impact echoed for eternity. The selection was not a medical evaluation. It was not about health. It was about utility. Could the body, standing in front of the officer, lift, carry, build? If yes, temporary life was granted. If no, death followed within hours. A young mother carrying a child might have been strong enough to work, but the presence of the child marked her for the gas chamber. A child who could not stand without leaning on a parent was marked as well. No explanation was given. Sometimes no words were spoken at all. The human voice disappears quickly in a place where decisions are made by gesture, eye, and gun. Those who were selected to die were told they were going to bathe. They were told to undress. They were told to fold their clothes neatly and remember where they placed them, because they would need them afterward. These instructions were deliberate. They maintained calm. They prevented panic. Panic disrupted efficiency. Efficiency was essential. The lie was efficient. The rooms where death occurred were cold in design, but warm in body heat once filled. They were sealed chambers disguised as bathhouses. Sometimes there were fake shower heads in the ceiling. Sometimes there were tiles on the walls. The sounds inside were muffled. The thud of bodies pressing toward the last pockets of air. The scrape of fingernails. The choked attempts to call out names. The gas, whether from Zyklon B pellets releasing hydrogen cyanide vapor, or from exhaust diverted from engines, stole breath before comprehension. Death came fast, but never instant. The terror filled the minutes. Outside, the machinery waited. Sonderkommando units, prisoners forced into labor, pulled bodies from the chambers, arranged them for burning, extracted valuables, removed evidence. Their hands did the worst work ever demanded of human beings. They saw everything. They knew everything. And they knew that when their usefulness ended, they too would be sent to the gas. Their time allotment was measured not in hours, but in the invisible countdown of necessity. The air around them was thick with ash. Their clothes carried the soot of the dead. Their eyes carried something no human mind is built to contain. The crematoria roared day and night. Flames reached upward, feeding on flesh, consuming entire generations. The chimneys did not rest. Ash settled on nearby fields, on rooftops, on the skin of people still living inside the camp. The sky itself became part of the machinery, carrying away the evidence of millions in pale, drifting particles. Somewhere beyond the fences, farmers worked fields, towns operated, trains ran. The world continued. The horror was not hidden in darkness, but in distance, in denial, in the ordinary functioning of daily life. The living in the camp experienced a different form of death, slow, methodical, grinding. Work battalions labored under watchtowers. Hunger hollowed the body until it became an outline of bone wrapped in skin. The daily ration was not designed to sustain, it was designed to prolong suffering. Bread that tasted of sawdust. Soup that was more water than anything else. A small tin dish passed from hand to hand until it became slick with desperation. Every calorie was a battle. Every night was a calculation. Will I wake tomorrow? The cold was an enemy as real as any guard. Winter howled through thin walls. Feet froze inside tattered boots. The wind took warmth the way starvation took strength. inch by inch, cell by cell. When the cold and hunger combined, the mind began to float. People forgot words. They forgot names. They forgot the sound of their own laughter. The camp stole not only life, but memory. Punishments inside the camp followed a logic beyond reason. A man might be shot for pausing, a woman beaten for crying out, a child executed as an example. The cruelty did not always have purpose. Sometimes it was simply expression. Power unchecked becomes theater. The guards performed cruelty to feel it. The sound of a whip crack in the air became as common as the clatter of plates in a kitchen. Normalcy inverted. And yet, within that horror, people formed bonds. They whispered names to remember themselves. They shared crumbs of bread, even when there was not enough to stay alive. They held hands in the dark. They recited prayers without sound. They found ways to say, "I am still human." And that insistence, quiet, fragile, stubborn, was resistance. There were moments, rare and terrible, when the machinery faltered. A valve stuck. A guard hesitated. A rumor spread that the Red Army was approaching. Panic flickered through the ranks of the captors, never the captives. The camp relied on secrecy, on speed, on silence. When news of the front lines closing and reached the commandant's office, new orders were issued. Destroy evidence. Burn files. Dig up mass graves. Crush bone fragments and scatter them. Make the land forget. But the land does not forget. Fields remember. Forests remember. Bones become part of the soil. Ash settles in layers that no rain can fully erase. The memory of death camps is not only in archives and testimonies, it is written into the earth itself. The most devastating truth is perhaps this: these places did not arise from madness. They arose from planning, from paperwork, from logistics, from men in comfortable rooms, drafting forms and schedules. The camps were the final link in a chain that began with a word spoken casually at a table, a signature added to a document, a train scheduled for departure. The journey from bureaucratic language to structured death was not a collapse into chaos. It was an ascent into organization. There is a terrible elegance in the sequence. Identify, isolate, transport, eliminate. Each step built on the one before it. Each required cooperation across professions, institutions, and borders. The death camps were not simply physical locations. They were systems. Systems designed to remove human beings from the fabric of the world. And even now, decades later, the camps whisper their truth. The wind through barbed wire sings a low lament. The empty barracks echo with the absence of millions. The cracked foundations of gas chambers speak in silence. The tracks leading toward the gates do not end where the rails stop. They continue into memory. The next chapter will move from the architecture of death to the architecture of concealment and resistance. How the people inside, even in the shadow of annihilation, found ways to defy the machinery built to erase them. Chapter 14. Resistance in the Dark. Defiance inside the system of death. There is a myth that the camps swallowed resistance completely, that inside the machinery of annihilation, rebellion was impossible. But that myth comforts the living more than it reflects the truth. Resistance did not disappear. It changed shape. It became quieter, smaller, more dangerous, more intimate. It moved in whispers, in glances, in hidden scraps of paper, in the passing of a crust of bread. It lived not only in explosions and uprisings, but in the stubborn decision to remain human in a place designed to erase humanity itself. To understand resistance inside the camps, you must first understand that survival itself was a form of defiance. Every day that a prisoner endured hunger that hollowed the body and cold that gnawed to the bone. Every morning they opened their eyes after a night where death had felt closer than breath. Each of these was an act of rebellion. The system expected them to break quickly, to collapse into silence. The fact that they did not, that they remembered who they were, that they spoke names, that they prayed, that they remembered songs, this was resistance. Small, quiet, and colossal. But resistance was not only psychological. It was also practical, strategic, and coordinated. Hidden beneath the surface of death was a network of human connection. Prisoners who had known each other before the camps, strangers who became allies through a shared glance of understanding, whispers passed in the latrines, notes hidden under floorboards. The camps were places of terror, but they were also places of information. People observed. People listened. People shared what they learned, how long a selection lasted, which guards could be bribed, which sheds were searched and which were not, which shifts allowed a moment of breath. Women played a central role in this resistance. In the kitchens, where food was rationed and controlled, they learned how to hide scraps beneath aprons, how to pass a potato skin in a closed fist, how to save crumbs from being swept away. They risked beatings and execution for these acts, but they continued. The sharing of food was not charity. It was strategic, a distribution of life where life had been stolen. A crumb of bread could keep a person alive one more day, and one more day meant one more chance to resist. Men working in labor battalions formed other networks. Bricklayers, carpenters, electricians. They used their tools to sabotage. A wire cut half a centimeter short. A steel beam weakened from the inside. A machine adjusted to malfunction after hours of use. These were not large actions, and the effect was not immediate. But sabotage accumulates. It slows production. It creates uncertainty. It forces guards and overseers to suspect that the enemy is not outside the fences, but inside them, walking, breathing, watching. There were also moments where resistance took the form of information. Prisoners smuggled out messages written in pencil stubs on pieces of cement sack paper, wrapped in cloth, hidden in seams of clothing, thrown from trains. These messages traveled farther than anyone believed possible. A scrap of paper discovered by a railway worker. A whispered sentence passed to a villager trading bread for stolen boots. A name spoken to a priest who knew how to listen without speaking in return. The outside world did not know everything that was happening, but it knew enough to know that something monstrous was unfolding. In the heart of the camps, there were also uprisings, rare, desperate, and astonishing in their bravery. At Sobibor, prisoners dug tunnels, stole weapons piece by piece, mapped guard routines. They organized in total silence, with no paper, no written plans, only memory. When the day came, they struck with knives made from filed-down shovels. They killed guards one by one, quietly at first, then with urgency when the alarm sounded. The camp burned. Many died in the escape, but those who survived carried witness out of hell. At Treblinka, prisoners smuggled stolen grenades inside a toolbox. They set fire to fuel stores. They overran guard towers. The smell of gunpowder and burning diesel filled the camp air. The revolt was brief, chaotic, devastating, but the camp could not continue in the same way afterward. Resistance altered the machinery. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Sonderkommando, men forced to handle the bodies of the dead, did something extraordinary. They stole small quantities of gunpowder from the munitions factory where women prisoners worked. Grain by grain, hidden in scraps of fabric and seams of dresses, passed hand to hand with the care of carrying embers in a windstorm. When enough was gathered, they destroyed Crematorium 4. The explosion shook the ground. Flames rose. The guards retaliated with ferocity. Many who took part were executed. But the explosion existed. It happened. It broke the illusion of total control. These acts were not only resistance against the camps. They were resistance against the logic of erasure. The camps were built to make people vanish without trace. Resistance, even when it failed, carved memory into the walls. And yet, not all resistance was explosive. Some was simply the refusal to forget oneself. A woman braided another woman's hair, even when both were starving. A father taught his child the alphabet using pebbles on the floor. A rabbi recited prayers without sound, because sound was dangerous. A poet whispered lines into the ear of someone in the next bunk, so that language, human language, survived. Music existed in the camps. Songs hummed under breath. Lullabies sung so softly they barely existed. Hebrew melodies. Folk songs. A marching song used to mock the guards encoded lyrics that the guards did not understand. These songs were threads that tied prisoners to the world before the fences, before the numbers tattooed on their arms. To sing was to insist, I existed before this. That existence cannot be erased. There were moments when prisoners looked into the eyes of another and remembered their own name. Identity in the camps was constantly under assault. Numbers replaced names. Hair was shaved. Clothing was standardized. Speech was punished. To speak someone's name was to give them life back. To say, I remember you, was an act of resistance. There were also those who resisted through witness. Some prisoners wrote accounts on scraps of paper and buried them in the ground, believing someone someday would find them. Some carved messages into walls. Some memorized the names of those who died, reciting them internally like a rosary. Some promised that if they survived, they would tell the world. The act of remembering became a form of rebellion stronger than any weapon. But resistance was not without cost. Every act of defiance risked punishment, not only for the individual, but for everyone near them. This was the terror that made resistance almost impossible, the fear that one person's courage might bring death to dozens. The system was designed to make guilt contagious, to turn solidarity into risk, and risk into silence. Yet solidarity happened anyway. There were betrayals, too. People who informed to save themselves, people broken by fear. There were fractions inside the prisoner population, national, political, personal tensions. Resistance was not pure or uncomplicated. It was human, with all the contradictions of human behavior under extreme pressure. Yet even with fear, betrayal, starvation, and exhaustion, resistance flickered like a flame that refused to be smothered. It appeared in places where no one expected it. A child who refused to let go of her mother's hand. A man who stood upright in roll call when collapse would have been easier. A woman who spit in a guard's face and died for it, but died standing. As the war turned and news of Allied advances filtered into the camps in whispers, the resistance changed. Hope appeared, not as joy, but as urgency. The machinery of murder accelerated to hide evidence. The guards began burning records. The crematoria burned even more furiously. The camps contracted like a dying animal thrashing. Prisoners knew that liberation did not guarantee survival. Many would die in the hours before liberation, in forced marches, in final executions carried out to silence witnesses. Resistance in the final months took on a different tone. Hide evidence, hide testimony, hide names and memory, so they could be spoken later, anywhere, even if the speaker survived only a few more hours. And still, they resisted. For every guard tower, there was someone planning where a weapon might be taken. For every crematorium, someone memorized the faces of those who passed. For every train track, someone loosened a bolt. For every number tattooed on an arm, someone whispered the name it tried to replace. Resistance did not defeat the camps, but it defeated the idea that the camps were absolute. They were not. Humanity did not disappear. It adapted. It fought. It endured. Resistance inside the camps is not measured in victories. It is measured in survival of meaning, in memory that cannot be burned, in names that refuse to vanish, in one hand holding another, even when both hands were shaking. The next chapter will turn to the collapse of this system, the unraveling of order, the marches into winter, the final acts of destruction and vengeance as the world outside the barbed wire closed in. Chapter 15. The Unraveling, Collapse, Liberation, and What Remained. It did not happen all at once. The system that had been constructed with such terrifying precision did not simply fall like a toppled statue. It cracked. It faltered. It leaked truth before it broke. The first signs were small. Trains that did not arrive on schedule, shipments of coal that never reached their destinations, guards who were transferred in haste. There were rumors in the camps. Whispers passed from barracks to barracks, that the Red Army was coming closer, that the Allies had landed in France, that the war was turning. Hope, which had been so dangerous to feel, flickered like a match in the wind. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. Yet as the front lines shifted, the killing accelerated. Power, when threatened, does not retreat gracefully. It lashes out. Orders pour down from Berlin. Dismantle evidence. Move prisoners. Destroy documents. Evacuate camps. The machinery of death, which had run so smoothly when supplies were plentiful and the state was strong, now twisted into something frantic, chaotic, desperate. Camps that once followed strict schedules now operated in panic. Crematoria burned day and night, not only to kill, but to erase. Ash was scattered in rivers. Bones were crushed into powder with wooden mallets. Buildings were dismantled brick by brick. It was an attempt to make history itself disappear. The camp guards understood what was coming. Some fled early, abandoning posts. Others stayed until the final hour, clinging to orders as if obedience could shield them. Commandants sent telegrams begging for more fuel, more trains, more time. They did not get them. The Reich that had once seemed invincible was collapsing, and the camps, so remote, so hidden, were suddenly exposed to the advancing world. The fences, once unbreakable, now trembled. For the prisoners, the collapse arrived first as confusion. Work routines shifted. Guards grew nervous. Selections happened less systematically. Sometimes there were no selections at all. Sometimes prisoners woke to find watchtowers unmanned for a moment, just a moment, and then manned again. Time felt distorted. Death could come at any second, and yet something new, something unimaginable after years of degradation, had entered the air. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is a terrible thing, but it is also the seed of possibility. And then the evacuations began. They call them marches. The death marches. They were not marches in the military sense or the ceremonial sense. They were long, endless, freezing processions through snow, mud, and forest. The goal was simple: move prisoners away from the approaching liberators. Move them far enough that they could not speak, could not testify, could not reveal what had been done. If they died along the way, so much the better. Imagine a line of thousands, skeletons in ragged coats, bare feet wrapped in cloth, eyes sunken and stunned. Guards walked beside them with rifles and dogs. The sound was a shuffle, not footsteps but dragging. Food was not provided. Water was wherever snow could be scooped from the ground. Those who fell were shot. Those who paused were shot. Those who tried to speak the names of the dead were struck with rifle butts until silence returned. Night brought no rest. Prisoners slept in barns, in frozen ditches, in open fields. The cold did not merely bite. It entered the body, it slowed the heart, it crystallized breath into pain. Survival was no longer a strategy. It was instinct. Along these routes, civilians watched. Some watched from windows. Some turned away. Some left bread on fence posts and melted snow in tin cups. Some called authorities to report escapees. Every human choice, even then, mattered. Not all camps were evacuated in time. Some were simply abandoned. In places like Majdanek, the collapse came faster than anticipated. Prisoners woke to silence. They waited, unsure if it was a trap. Slowly, impossibly, they walked toward the gates. They expected gunfire. None came. They stepped outside and realized the guard were gone. They were free, but freedom felt like a hallucination, something so different from the world they knew that it did not fit inside the mind. Those who were liberated by advancing forces encountered their rescuers like beings from a different world. Soldiers who entered the camps stopped in their tracks, stunned into silence. The sights were beyond anything their training had prepared them to see. Bodies piled like wood. Survivors so thin that the wind could have carried them away. Children who did not know how to speak anymore. The soldiers, hardened by war, wept openly. The liberators brought food, but too much food could kill. The starving cannot digest abundance. So they fed them slowly, carefully. They wrapped them in blankets. They spoke to them in languages that the survivors could not always understand, but tone alone conveyed everything. You are safe now. You are alive. The world sees you. But survival was not a clean miracle. For many, liberation came too late. Bodies that had endured too much broke when the terror finally released its grip. Some survivors died hours after freedom. Some days. Some weeks. Their bodies had held on to life only through the force of struggle. When the struggle ended, so did the life. Those who lived now faced the vast, impossible question. What now? Some tried to go home. But home had changed. Houses had new occupants. Towns pretended not to remember. Neighbors who once greeted them now lowered their gaze. Anti-Jewish violence continued in some places, even after the camps fell. Survival was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of another kind of endurance. Some survivors emigrated. Palestine, America, Canada, South America, carrying with them nothing but memory. Some stayed in displaced persons camps for years, waiting for visas, waiting for the world to decide what to do with those who had seen the abyss. Memory became its own burden. Some could not speak of what they saw. Silence was a shield. Others spoke relentlessly, as if speaking could carve meaning into the senseless. Some wrote testimonies on scraps of paper while still in hospital beds. Some recited names like prayers, terrified of forgetting even one face. Trials began. Evidence was gathered. The minutes from Wannsee resurfaced, a bureaucratic relic that revealed the coldness of planning. Camp commandants, guards, clerks, some fled, some hid, some were captured. The world learned words it had never meant to need. Genocide, crimes against humanity. Justice arrived unevenly. Some perpetrators were executed. Some were imprisoned. Some lived ordinary lives after the war. Evil does not always end cleanly. Survivors carried numbers tattooed on their arms. Some covered them. Some displayed them. Some traced them absent-mindedly when lost in thought. These numbers were more than marks. They were coordinates in history, proof written in skin. The world tried to understand. Museums were built. Books were written. Films were made. Students were taught. But understanding is not the same as remembering. And remembering is not the same as preventing. The death camps were torn down or turned into memorials. Grass grew over trenches where bodies once lay. Flowers bloomed near ashes. Birds sang over barracks. Time moved forward with cruel normalcy. But the ground remembers. The air remembers. The silence remembers. The question that haunts history is not how millions died. It is how millions were killed while the world continued to turn. The trains ran. The furnaces burned. The papers were stamped. The meetings were held. The signatures were signed. The silence, in many places, was chosen. The Holocaust was not just an event. It was a system built by people. People who made decisions. People who looked away. People who obeyed. People who resisted. People who survived. When we speak of liberation, we must also speak of responsibility, not simply of those who murdered, but of those who allowed the machinery to run. The chapter ends not with conclusion, but with inheritance. Because the Holocaust is not only history, it is warning. A system built on hatred and bureaucracy does not need firestorms or mobs. It needs obedience. It needs silence. It needs the belief that ordinary people cannot make a difference. The next chapter will not be spoken by those in the past. The next chapter belongs to those who remember.